Give me 1 hour. The garage went dead silent. Staring at a 22-year-old kid with grease on his hands and holes in his boots. A kid who had owned nothing. And according to every man in that room, was nothing. Jackson Morrison, the man they called Hawk, looked at him for a long time. Then he said the words that would change everything. You fail, and that bike never runs again. You understand what I'm telling you? Boy, Caleb Dawson nodded once. He understood perfectly. Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and come ride this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm hit Maricopa County, the way Arizona storms always did, without apology and without warning. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple. The next, it was opening up like it had a grudge. Rain hammered the desert floor and turned the red dirt into something that sucked at your boots. And if you were unlucky enough to be walking that night alone, on the wrong side of the highway, with a toolbox that weighed 42 pounds and blisters on both heels, you knew the desert wasn't interested in your problems. Caleb Dawson was unlucky enough. He had been walking for 6 miles when the lights of the compound first appeared through the rain. He wasn't looking for them. He had been aiming for a truck stop he'd heard about from a waitress in Tucson, a woman named Darlene, who had given him a free cup of coffee and told him there was a place off Route 300 where long haulers parked overnight and sometimes shared food. That was where he'd planned to sleep. Under the awning of a truck stop, inside a space no bigger than a coat closet, wrapped in the one dry sweatshirt he had left. Instead, he found the compound. He almost walked past it. The gate was heavy iron, reinforced at the hinges, and the fence that ran from it extended 50 yards in both directions before disappearing into scrub brush and darkness. There were lights on inside, warm, amber light leaking from a building that sounded like it had 30 or 40 people in it. Music, low and hard, the kind of music that didn't ask permission. What stopped Caleb wasn't the lights or the music. It was the sound coming from the garage. It was subtle, and in the rain it was nearly impossible to catch. But Caleb had spent his entire life listening to machines the way other people listen to conversations. He heard rhythms inside engines that everyone else wrote off as background noise. He heard hesitation in timing belts before they snapped. He heard grief in metal that was being worked against its own nature. And standing outside that gate in the middle of an Arizona monsoon, he heard something that made him stop walking entirely. An engine was running, or rather it was trying to run. It fired and died, fired and died, fired, held for 3 full seconds, then died again, like something was strangling it from inside. Caleb had never heard that particular failure pattern before. He stood still in the rain and listened to it for 30 seconds, cataloging it without even meaning to. His brain was already doing what it had always done, disassembling the sound, separating the components, looking for the anomaly. What he found surprised him. Because the engine wasn't weak. Whatever was choking, it wasn't damage or age or neglect. Whatever was wrong with that engine, it sounded deliberate. He didn't knock on the gate. He couldn't explain later why he didn't. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't stupidity. He was 22 years old and had been running on bad luck for so long that he had stopped measuring it. He lifted the latch on the pedestrian access panel beside the main gate, pushed it open, and walked in. The compound was larger than it looked from the road. 2 long buildings ran parallel to each other and connected by a covered walkway. The garage was on the left, a converted structure with industrial overhead doors. And through the gap at the bottom of one of those doors, Caleb could see light and hear voices. The main building on the right was where the music was coming from, and through the windows, he could see silhouettes moving. People gathered around tables. He went left. He pushed the side door open and stepped into the garage. Later, he would try to count how many men were in that room, and he always came up with a number between 20 and 25. They were standing in a loose cluster around a motorcycle that sat under 3 industrial lights on a raised platform in the center of the space. The bike wasn't running anymore. Someone had killed the ignition. But the smell of exhaust and the heat coming off the engine told Caleb it had been running very recently. Nobody noticed him at first. They were all looking at a man in his 50s who was standing over the motorcycle with his hands on his hips and a look on his face that Caleb recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who had given up but hadn't admitted it to himself yet. "That's it," the man said. "That's the last time I crank it tonight. She's done." "Hawk, I said she's done, Eddie. Go get the others." The man they called Hawk was built like something that had been assembled for the specific purpose of making other men feel small. He had a jaw like a shelf, forearms that belonged on a man 6 inches taller, and gray threading through his dark hair that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than older. He wore a vest with patches that Caleb recognized, not because he followed the Hells Angels specifically, but because certain symbols announced themselves regardless of whether you were paying attention. Jackson Hawk Morrison, chapter president, Maricopa County. Caleb absorbed all of this in about 4 seconds. Then someone saw him. The hell? It wasn't a question. It was more like the verbal equivalent of a wall coming up. The man who said it was wide-shouldered and had a beard that came to his collarbone, and he was already moving before the words were fully out of his mouth. He covered the distance between himself and Caleb in about 3 steps and stopped close enough that Caleb could smell cigarettes and motor oil. "You lost, kid?" Caleb looked at him. Then he looked past him at the motorcycle. "No," Caleb said. "I heard the engine from the road that stopped the man with the beard." It wasn't the answer he expected. He turned slightly and looked at Hawk, and the movement created just enough of a gap that Caleb could see the motorcycle clearly for the first time. He forgot to breathe. He knew motorcycles. He had been repairing them since he was 9 years old, when a neighbor named Gerald Pratt had let him disassemble a 1978 Sportster in exchange for cutting the grass every week from April through October. He had learned on junkers and worked his way up through machines of increasing complexity and value, never with money, always with labor-traded skills. Borrowed time, favors owed. He had touched a lot of extraordinary machines in his life. He had never seen anything like this. The motorcycle sitting under those 3 industrial lights was not just expensive. It was significant. He could see that from 15 feet away. The custom work on the frame was so precise and so unusual that it looked less like fabrication and more like sculpture. The engine casing had modifications he had never encountered in any textbook or workshop manual. The entire machine had a quality to it that stopped somewhere between engineering and obsession, the kind of obsession that only happens when someone puts their whole self into a single object and decides that object will be the one thing in their life that is exactly right. "What do you know about engines?" Hawk said. He hadn't moved from his position by the motorcycle. He was looking at Caleb with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite contempt, something in between. "Measuring." "Enough," Caleb said. "Enough." Hawk repeated it like he was tasting the word. 3 factory-certified Harley technicians have been through this garage in the last 5 years. 2 independent engineers. A man who came down from the Denver facility specifically. You know what all of them had in common? Caleb waited. None of them could tell me what was wrong with that bike. Hawk took 1 step toward him. They all had credentials. They all had references. They all had their own definition of enough. And every single one of them left here without fixing a damn thing. They were looking for what was broken, Caleb said. Hawk stopped. The room went quiet in a specific way, the way rooms go quiet when something is said that is either very stupid or very correct, and no one is sure yet which it is. "Say that again," Hawk said. The mechanics who looked at the bike, they were looking for the broken part, the damaged component, the worn-out piece. Caleb held his ground, even though every nerve in his body was telling him to take a step backward. "That's not why this engine sounds the way it sounds. You've heard it run for, 30 seconds? From outside a fence in a rainstorm? I've heard enough." Hawk stared at him for a long time. The man with the beard had drifted back into the cluster of men, and the whole room was watching now with the focused attention of people who had nothing to do but wait and see what happened next. "What's your name?" Hawk said. "Caleb. Caleb Dawson. Something moved across Hawk's face at that name. It was fast, a quarter of a second, and Caleb caught it, only because he had spent years watching faces for the small movements that happened before people decided to lie. It wasn't recognition exactly. It was more like a name landing somewhere it wasn't expected. Then it was gone. How old are you? 22. Where are you coming from? Tucson. Caleb paused. Before that, El Paso. Before that, a few other places. You got somewhere to be tonight? No. Hawk looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he said, give you 1 hour. You want it or not? Yes. One condition. Hawk moved aside so Caleb had a clear line of sight to the motorcycle. You fail. This bike gets retired. Tonight. I cover it up. I walk away and nobody touches it again. I've been chasing this problem for 20 years and I'm done. You fail. It's done. You understand what I'm telling you? Caleb looked at the motorcycle. He looked at the engine casing, at the lines of the frame, at the modifications he couldn't fully understand yet, but could feel the intelligence behind. He thought out 20 years. He thought about a machine that someone had spent everything on and that no one had been able to bring back. He said, I understand. 1 hour, Hawk said. Clock starts when I leave the room. The men filed out. Not all of them, 4 stayed behind, positioned at different points in the garage, watching. Caleb didn't argue about that. He set his toolbox down on the floor beside the motorcycle and just stood there for a moment. Then he got to work. The first thing he did was nothing. That was the trick that nobody without real instinct ever learned, that the most important 30 seconds in any diagnostic process was the 30 seconds when you made yourself stop reaching for tools and just paid attention. He put his hands on the engine casing, not to feel for anything specific, but to feel for everything general. He closed his eyes. He breathed through his nose and cataloged the smell exhaust. Yes, but also something metallic and sharp underneath it that had no business being there. He tilted his head and ran his fingertips along the surface until he found the vibration pattern that the engine left behind, even after it was shut down. The way metal still trembles slightly for minutes after a load is removed. You've got a system, said one of the men watching from the side of the garage. Caleb opened his eyes. The man who had spoken was younger than the others, maybe mid-30s, with a lean build and watchful eyes that had a different quality than the rest. Less aggressive, more curious. I listened first, Caleb said. The other mechanics didn't do that. I know. How do you know? Because if they had, they would have heard what I'm hearing right now. Caleb turned back to the motorcycle. Your engine isn't failing. It's being interrupted. The man straightened slightly. Interrupted by what? That's what I'm going to figure out. He opened his toolbox and started with the basics, not because he thought the problem was basic, but because he needed to rule out the obvious before he could give himself permission to go looking for what wasn't obvious. He checked the fuel system first. Clean. He checked the ignition components, all of them serviceable, some of them nearly new. He checked the timing. He checked the air intake. He checked every variable that a standard diagnostic process would tell you to check, and all of them came back the same way, normal. 30 minutes had passed. One of the men by the door shifted his weight and said something quietly to the man beside him. Caleb didn't look up. He was inside his own head now, working through the problem the way he always did, not linearly, not the way textbooks taught, but in concentric circles, starting from the outside and working inward. He went back to the engine casing. The modifications on the exterior were extraordinary. Whoever had built this machine had added a secondary calibration system that Caleb had never seen before, and he could see now, after 30 minutes of close examination, that most of the mechanics who'd come through on this garage had probably assumed it was decorative, a cosmetic modification, something added for aesthetics. It wasn't decorative, it was functional, and it was essential, and it had never been properly completed. Caleb pressed his fingers along the inner edge of the secondary housing and found the gap 2 millimeters, invisible to a casual inspection, where a component was missing. Not broken, not worn out, missing, removed deliberately at some point in the past 20 years by someone who knew exactly where it was and exactly how important it was. His hand was shaking slightly when he pulled it back. He had been in this garage for 40 minutes. He had 20 left. "You find something?" said the young watchful man from across the room. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He was running the numbers in his head, the calibration system, the missing component, the specific failure pattern he'd heard from the road. It all connected. It connected so cleanly and so completely that it felt less like a discovery and more like a confirmation of something he'd already suspected. But it also led somewhere he hadn't expected. Because to understand why the component was missing, you had to understand the calibration system. And to understand the calibration system, you had to understand how it was designed. And to understand how it was designed, you needed more than a technical manual. You needed to understand the person who built it. Caleb reached into the secondary housing again, more carefully this time, and found what he was looking for, not the missing component, but the space where the missing component had sat. Inside that space, protected by the housing itself, was something that should not have been there. It was too small for most people to notice. It required a specific angle and a specific light source and hands that knew how to look for things that were hidden in plain sight. It was a metal disc about the size of a quarter pressed into a groove in the housing wall. On the disc, stamped into the metal, was a marking. DMC 2001. Caleb stared at it. He could hear his own heartbeat. D.D. Daniel Dawson. The room tilted slightly. Or maybe the room stayed exactly where it was, and it was Caleb who tilted, which was the feeling he always got when something impossibly large presented itself in a space too small to contain it. He sat back on his heels and looked at the motorcycle, the entire machine now, not a component, not a system, and what he saw for the first time was not just engineering. He saw his father's hands. Daniel Dawson had disappeared from Caleb's life 9 days before Caleb's second birthday. This was the sum total of what Caleb knew about his father. A name, a date, and the version his mother had given him that the man had walked away because some people weren't built for staying. She hadn't said it bitterly. That was almost worse. She'd said it the way you say something you've made peace with, and her peace with it was something Caleb had never been able to share. He had spent 20 years making peace with a ghost. What he had not spent 20 years doing was assuming that the ghost had any particular skill, any particular legacy, any particular fingerprint on the world. He had been wrong. The motorcycle under his hands, the 20-year mystery that had defeated every credentialed expert in 4 states, had been built by Daniel Dawson. And not just built. It had been built with a brilliance and a specificity and a personal signature that told Caleb, with a certainty he felt in the bones of his hands, that his father had cared about this machine the way people only care about things they are trying to leave behind, or leave for someone. Caleb's throat was tight. He had 50 minutes on the clock. He'd been given 60. That meant he had 10 minutes left. He stood up. "I need to talk to Hawk," he said. The young watchful man looked at him. "Clock's still running." "I know. I need to talk to him anyway." The man held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked to the door. Hawk came back into the garage 2 minutes later. He looked at Caleb standing beside the motorcycle, and his expression was exactly what it had been an hour ago, measuring, contained, giving nothing away. "Clock ran out," he said. "Not quite," Caleb said. "I've got 8 minutes. You found the problem?" "I found the problem. I can fix it." Caleb paused. "But before I do, I need you to tell me something." Hawk said nothing. He waited. "This motorcycle," Caleb said. "Who built it?" Another movement across Hawk's face. Slower this time. Harder to read. "Why? Because whoever built it left a signature inside the secondary housing. A metal disc, stamped." Caleb looked at him steadily. DD 2001. The garage was so quiet that Caleb could hear rain on the roof, the slow tick of cooling metal, the breath of the 4 men still positioned around the room. Hawk stood completely still and looked at Caleb with an expression that had shifted into something Caleb couldn't categorize. Not anger, not surprise exactly, something closer to recognition. "You know that name," Caleb said. "Where are you from?" Hawk said. His voice was different. "Quieter, I told you." "Before Tucson, El Paso." "Before that, what's your mother's name?" Caleb stopped. He looked at Hawk Morrison, chapter president of the Maricopa County Hells Angels, a man he had met 80 minutes ago in a rainstorm, a man who should have had no connection to anything in his life. And he felt the floor shift under him. Sandra Dawson, Caleb said. Her name is Sandra Dawson. Hawk closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed for 5 seconds. Caleb counted them. Then Hawk opened his eyes and looked at the motorcycle, and then looked at Caleb, and there was something in his face that had not been there before. Something that looked remarkably, impossibly, like grief. Your father built this bike, Hawk said. Caleb's hands had stopped shaking. He was past shaking. I figured that out. He built it in 2001. Took him 2 years. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Hawk looked at the motorcycle. He was the best mechanic I ever knew, the most gifted. And then one night he stopped. He left, Caleb said. He left. Hawk said it quietly, like an agreement, like something he had said to himself many times before. And the bike hasn't run right since. He looked at Caleb. I always thought it was grief, like the machine could tell he was gone. It wasn't grief, Caleb said. It was sabotage. The word hit the room like a physical thing. Caleb heard one of the watching men draw a breath. Hawk's expression went very still. What did you say? Hawk said, the calibration system your father built the secondary housing in the engine casing. It has a component missing. Caleb kept his voice level. He had said hard things to hard men before, and the only way through was straight. It wasn't a design flaw. It wasn't wear. The component was removed, deliberately, by someone who knew where it was and what it did. Hawk stared at him. That's why every mechanic failed, Caleb continued. They were diagnosing a machine that was designed to look broke from the outside, but was actually running against itself internally. Without that component, the calibration system interrupts the engine at irregular intervals. Mimics different kinds of mechanical failure, depending on how you're testing it. No standard diagnostic process would ever catch it. How did you catch it? Because I wasn't looking for what was wrong. I was listening for what was being hidden. Hawk turned away from him and walked 3 steps to the wall and put one hand against it and stood there. The watching men didn't move. Nobody said anything. You can fix it? Hawk said finally, his back still turned. In 8 minutes, Caleb said. But whoever removed that component knew this machine. Knew it well. I can fix the bike, but I can't fix what it means. He paused. That's going to be your problem. Hawk turned around. He looked at Caleb for a long time. Then he looked at the motorcycle. Then he said, fix it. Caleb got down on his knees beside the engine casing. He reached into his toolbox and found the components he'd carried for 3 years without knowing why, a set of precision calibration rings in graduated sizes that he had salvaged from a machine shop in El Paso that was being cleaned out. Rings that no standard motorcycle used and that he had held on to because they were precise and beautiful and the kind of thing that a person with a real feeling for engineering couldn't throw away. He held one of them up to the gap in the secondary housing, and it fit. Not approximately, not with adjustment. It fit exactly, as if it had been made for this space. As if someone had known, somewhere, sometime, that it would end up here. Caleb pressed it into place. His hands were steady now. His heart was not. He recalibrated the secondary system, reset the timing relationship between the primary and secondary chambers, and reseated the housing cover with 3 bolts that required a specific sequence he worked out from the design logic of the system because, of course, his father had left no instructions, no manual, no guide. He had built the thing out of his own mind and left it for the world to figure out, or left it for one specific person to figure out. Caleb sat back. Start it, he said. Hawk looked at him. Go ahead, Caleb said. Start it. Hawk walked to the motorcycle and stood over it for a moment with his hand on the ignition. He had the look of a man who had prepared himself for disappointment so many times that he no longer trusted the feeling of hope. He turned the key. He pressed the starter. The engine fired, and it didn't die. It held. Rough, at first rough the way a man's voice is rough after he hasn't spoken in a long time, and then it smoothed. And then, under 3 industrial lights in a garage in Maricopa County in the middle of an Arizona rainstorm, The most extraordinary motorcycle that any of them had ever seen began to run the way it had always been meant to run. Deep, steady, powerful, alive. Hawk had his eyes closed again. Caleb watched him and said nothing. The four watching men had all moved forward without realizing it. One of them said something under his breath that might have been a prayer. The young watchful man, who had been asking questions all night, stood at Caleb's shoulder and said, quietly, "How did you know the ring would fit?" Caleb looked at the motorcycle. At his father's machine, running for the first time in 20 years. "I didn't," he said. "But some things just know where they belong." The engine ran. The rain came down. And somewhere in the space between the sound of the machine and the silence of the men who listened to it, Caleb Dawson understood that tonight was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that was going to change every life in that room, including his own. The engine ran for 11 minutes straight before Hawk reached over and cut the ignition. Not because anything was wrong. Because he needed the room to be quiet again. Because he needed to think, and the sound of that engine, the sound of something that had been silent for 20 years, was making thinking impossible. He stood with his hands still on the key and his back to the room, and nobody said a word. That was the thing about men who had ridden together long enough they learned when silence was the right language. The four men who had stayed in the garage understood that something had shifted in the room that went beyond a motorcycle running again, and they held the quiet the way you hold something fragile that you don't fully understand yet. Caleb was sitting on an overturned crate 3 feet from the bike, his toolbox closed beside him, his forearms resting on his knees. He was looking at his hands. He'd been looking at them since the engine fired, turning them over slowly, like they belonged to someone else, like he was trying to reconcile what they had just done with what he knew about his life up to tonight. He was 22 years old. He had no address, no bank account, no phone that held more than 7 contacts. He had a toolbox that had traveled across 4 states in the back of borrowed trucks and 1 Greyhound bus. He had a mother in Albuquerque who called him on the 7th of every month because she said she could not remember other dates reliably, and he had never told her that he knew she remembered perfectly fine and that the 7th was his father's birthday. He had never had a father, and now his father was everywhere in this room. Caleb. Hawk said his name without turning around. "Yeah, come with me." Hawk walked out of the garage side door, and Caleb followed him without asking where they were going. They crossed the covered walkway between the 2 buildings, and instead of going into the main hall where the music and the voices were, Hawk turned left and went to a smaller door at the end, an office, from the look of it, or something that had been converted to one. He held it open, and Caleb went through. The room had a desk and 2 chairs and a metal shelving unit along one wall that was stacked with binders and file boxes, and, on the top shelf, a row of photographs. Hawk closed the door and didn't turn on any additional light, and the lamp on the desk threw a warm circle that didn't quite reach the edges of the room. Hawks sat down on the edge of the desk and crossed his arms and looked at Caleb the way a man looks at a problem he has been avoiding for years. "How much do you know about your father?" Hawk said. "Almost nothing," Caleb said. "He left before I turned 2. My mother told me his name. That's most of it." "She never told you what he did?" "She said he worked on engines. She said he was good at it. She made it sound like a hobby." Hawk made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "A hobby?" He shook his head. "Your father was the most gifted mechanical engineer I have ever met in my life. I've known this chapter since 1987. I've seen gifted guys come through this door, men who could rebuild a transmission blindfolded, men who could hear a timing issue from 20 feet away. None of them was Daniel." Caleb was very still. "He came to us in 1998, Hawk continued. 28 years old. Walked in the same way you did tonight. Actually, no introduction, no credentials. Just showed up and asked if he could look at a machine nobody else could figure out. It was a different bike, a 96 Electra Glide that had been misfiring since the day we bought it." Hawk paused. "He fixed it in 40 minutes. What happened after that?" "He stayed. Not as a member, not at first, just as the mechanic. Our mechanic. He was here 4 or 5 days a week for 2 years before anyone even brought up the cut. Hawk glanced at the shelf of photographs. He was different, not in a way that created trouble, just in a way that made you pay attention. He didn't talk much, but when he talked, people listened. He had this way of looking at a machine and seeing what it was trying to be, not just what it was. Caleb said nothing. He was doing what he always did when someone gave him information he needed, holding it carefully, not rushing it, letting it settle. The 2.5 million bike was his idea, Hawk said, not mine. I want to be clear about that. I gave him the budget because I trusted him and because he'd already done things in our garage that nobody else had managed. But the machine was his vision. He spent 2 years on it. 2 years, Caleb. There were weeks he barely slept. He was trying to build something that had never existed, a custom calibration system that could self-regulate based on rider input and environmental conditions. No computer interface, all mechanical. Pure engineering. Hawk's jaw tightened. It was working. In early 2001, it was actually working. I wrote it once, about 6 weeks before everything went wrong, and I knew right then that the man had done something extraordinary, and then he left. And then he left. Hawk said it flat. May 14th, 2001. I came to the garage in the morning and his tools were gone, and the bike was on the platform with a tarp over it, and there was no note. Nothing. Like he was never here. He looked at Caleb. I tried to find him. I'm not going to pretend I didn't try. I knew about your mother. By then they'd been together, maybe 8 months, I think. I called the number I had for her, and she told me he was gone, and that she didn't know where, and that I should leave it alone. He paused. She sounded like a woman who had made a decision to move forward and wasn't going to revisit it. That sounds about right, Caleb said quietly. For the first 6 months after he left, I told myself the bike just needed adjustment. A calibration issue, a component that needed settling. I had 3 guys look at it, and they all came back with nothing. The year after that, I brought in outside help. And the year after that. And at some point, it stopped being about fixing the bike and became about something else. Hawk stopped. About him, Caleb said. About understanding why he left. Why he walked away from a machine he loved and a woman who was carrying his son and a brotherhood that trusted him. Hawk's voice didn't harden when he said it. It did the opposite, which was worse somehow. It went quiet and careful. Like a man handling something he'd learned not to grip too hard. I thought if I could figure out what was wrong with the bike, I'd figure out what was wrong with the rest of it. Stupid, probably. Not stupid, Caleb said. Maybe not. Hawk picked up a file folder from the desk and set it back down without opening it. What you told me in the garage about the component being removed deliberately. Yes, you're certain. The gap in the housing was clean. No wear marks. No corrosion in the thread seats. That component was removed after manufacture, not lost during use. And it was removed by someone who knew the calibration system well enough to access the inner housing without damaging the surrounding components. Caleb held his gaze. Most of the mechanics who came through here probably didn't even know the secondary housing opened. Whoever took that piece knew the bike better than almost anyone. Hawk was quiet for a long moment. Better than almost anyone, he repeated. Daniel built that system himself. He didn't share the blueprints. I don't think there were blueprints. Honestly, I think it existed primarily in his head. The men who helped him were working on individual components. Nobody else knew the whole picture. Nobody else, Caleb said. But someone did. Yes. Hawk stood up. He walked to the shelf and looked at the row of photographs without touching them. There's a name I should tell you. A man named Victor Malone. Caleb waited. Victor came to this chapter the same year your father did. They were closer than most. Victor was a few years older, had more history with the club, was the one who vouched for Daniel initially. They worked together, rode together. If Daniel trusted anyone in this building with the technical details of what he was building, it was Victor. Where is he now? Caleb asked. Still here. Hawk turned around. Victor has been a member of this chapter for 23 years. He's been at every meeting, every run, every gathering. He's 61 years old, and he's been in that main hall for the last 2 hours. He paused. and he has not spoken your father's name in my presence for 20 years. The lamp flickered once. Neither of them looked at it. You think he took the component, Caleb said. I don't know what I think, Hawk said. But I know that Victor knew that machine better than anyone except Daniel. And I know that whatever drove your father away from this place happened about 3 weeks before he disappeared. And Victor was involved. He stopped. There was a night in April 2001. I wasn't there. I heard about it secondhand. And the version changed every time I heard it. All I know for certain is that Daniel and Victor had a confrontation in this garage. And after that night, something between them was broken. Your father went quiet. He stopped coming around as much. And then 6 weeks later, he was gone. Caleb stood up. I need to talk to Victor Malone. Caleb, tonight. His voice was level, but there was nothing soft in it. I fixed the bike. That was the deal. I want to talk to Victor Malone tonight. Hawk looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once and walked to the door. The main hall was loud and warm and smelled like beer and motor oil and a specific kind of communal life that Caleb had never been part of, but recognized instinctively the smell of people who had made a choice to belong to each other. Long tables ran the length of the room. Maybe 40 men, a handful of women. At the far end, a sound system was pushing classic rock through 2 speakers mounted high on the wall, loud enough to feel, but not loud enough to prevent conversation. Hawk walked directly through the room without stopping to speak to anyone, and the crowd parted for him, without being asked, the way water parts around something solid. Caleb stayed 1 step behind and felt the eyes come to him the same way they had in the garage, not hostile. Exactly, but measuring. Word had already moved. He could see it in the way men watched him and then looked at each other. Victor Malone was sitting at the far left table with 3 other men, his back to the wall, in the way of someone who had spent long enough in rooms like this to know where to sit. He was big, not as big as Hawk, but the kind of big that spoke to a younger version of himself that had been bigger still. His hair had gone almost completely white, and he wore it short, and he had the worn, deliberate face of a man who had done significant amounts of being careful for a significant number of years. He saw them coming before they were halfway across the room. Caleb watched him see Hawk first, nod slightly, start to compose a greeting, and then his eyes moved to Caleb and the greeting went unfinished. Something happened in Victor Malone's face that Caleb had seen before, in different contexts, on different faces. It was the look of a man encountering something he thought he had successfully locked behind him. He recognized Caleb. Not Caleb specifically, he had never met Caleb, but he recognized what Caleb was, who Caleb belonged to. It was in the structure of his face, probably the jaw, the forehead, the particular way his eyes were set. Caleb had been told once by his mother's sister that he was the image of his father, and she had said it with a mixture of wonder and discomfort that he had never quite forgotten. Victor, Hawk said. He pulled out the chair across from Malone and sat down, and his tone was the tone of a man who had decided that a conversation was happening, whether anyone was ready for it or not. I want you to meet someone. Victor looked at Caleb for 3 full seconds. I know who he is, he said. The 3 men at the table with Victor had all gone quiet. One of them started to get up, and Victor said, "Stay," and the man stayed. Caleb sat down. He wasn't going to let himself be standing for this. You know who I am, Caleb said, but I don't know much about you. I know your name. I know you were close to my father, and I know you had access to the secondary housing in that motorcycle. Victor's expression didn't change. He was too experienced for visible reactions, which meant his control was itself a kind of tell. The bike's running, Hawk said quietly. Cape fixed it. Something moved through Victor, then small, controlled, but real. He looked at Hawk. Running, he repeated. Running the way Daniel built it to run. Full calibration system, steady idle, the sound she was always supposed to make. Hawk leaned forward slightly. Because someone removed a component from the secondary housing 20 years ago, and we're sitting here tonight to talk about why. Victor looked down at the table. He turned his glass a quarter rotation and turned it back. The 3 men with him were reading the room and staying very, very still. Where do you want to do this? Victor said. Right here is fine, Caleb said. Victor looked up at him. His eyes were dark gray, and they held a great deal not malice. Not what Caleb had expected, not the flat indifference of a man who didn't care about the damage he'd caused. What they held was more complicated, heavier. You look exactly like him, Victor said. So I've been told. Your father was my best friend. Victor said it without sentimentality, without softening, just a statement delivered flat. For 3 years, he was closer to me than my own brothers. I would have done anything for that man. And then, Caleb said, and then he made a mistake. Victor's jaw shifted. A bad one. Not the kind of mistake you fix. The kind that ends something. Tell me. Victor looked at Hawk. Hawk said nothing, which was the same as permission. Victor turned back to Caleb, and in his face, Caleb could see the specific exhaustion of a man who has carried something alone for 2 decades and has arrived, against all his plans, at the moment of putting it down. There was an accident, Victor said. March 2001. A test ride for the bike, out on Route 347. Your father was running her hard. He wanted to stress test the calibration system at speed. I was following on my own bike. He stopped, picked up his glass and set it back down without drinking. There was a kid on a bicycle, came out of a side road without looking. Your father swerved to avoid him, lost control on the gravel shoulder. He went down hard. Caleb waited. He was fine. Got up, shook it off, checked the bike. The kid was fine. Victor's voice dropped, but there was a car behind me. A woman named Carol. She wasn't part of our group, just a civilian driver who happened to be on that road. She swerved to avoid us and went into the median. He stopped again. Longer this time. She hit her head. She spent 11 days in the hospital. She survived, but she had damaged neurological damage that didn't fully present until months later. She lost her job. She couldn't drive anymore. She had a daughter who was 12 years old. The room around them was loud enough that nobody at the other tables could hear this conversation. Caleb was glad of it. Your father reported the accident to the police, Victor continued. Cooperated fully. His license was suspended. There was a settlement from his insurance. He did everything right, legally speaking. Victor's voice had gone to a place beyond bitterness, somewhere past it, in the flat territory on the other side. But Carol was my sister. Caleb went very still. Nobody knew that, Victor said. Daniel didn't know when it happened. I'd never brought family into the club, never talked about Carol specifically. He found out about 3 weeks later when I told him, and I told him because I wasn't handling it well. I was angry, and I was grieving, and I needed him to understand why. He looked at his hands. What I expected was, I don't know, guilt, acknowledgement, some kind of breaking. What I got was Daniel sitting across from me very quietly and saying that he was sorry, that he would do anything to help, that no amount of help would be enough, but that he would try for the rest of his life if Carol would let him. That's not a man walking away from his mistakes, Caleb said carefully. No, Victor said, it's not. But I wasn't hearing it. I was hearing a man who had put my sister in a hospital and who was still somehow in possession of everything, his talent, his reputation, this incredible machine he'd built, a woman who loved him and was about to have his child. And my sister couldn't get out of bed in the morning without pain. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first crack in 20 minutes of control. So I did something I've spent 20 years living with. Hawk was very still on the other side of the table. I went into the garage at night, Victor said. 3 nights before Daniel disappeared. He hadn't disappeared yet. I didn't know he was going to. I went into the garage and I opened the secondary housing and I took the calibration ring. He didn't look away from Caleb. I told myself I was going to keep it until he did right by Carol, until I decided he'd earned it back. I told myself it wasn't permanent. He stopped, and then he was gone, and the ring was in my possession, and I couldn't put it back. Not without explaining, not without saying out loud what I'd done to the machine, and what I'd done to the brotherhood, and what I'd done to a man who had actually, in the end, done everything he could to make it right. Where is the calibration ring now? Hawk said. His voice was very quiet. Victor reached into his vest pocket and set something on the table. It was a small metal ring, slightly oxidized, with a groove around its outer edge that matched exactly the gap Caleb had filled with one of his own salvage components. Caleb looked at it. He thought about three things at the same time. The 11 minutes the engine had run tonight on a replacement ring that fit by coincidence or by something larger than coincidence. The 20 years this ring had been in a man's pocket, while a machine sat silent and a kid grew up without a father. And the fact that his father had apparently spent the last weeks of his time in this compound trying to make something right and had disappeared before anyone knew whether he'd managed it. Where did he go? Caleb asked. When he left, do you know? No, Victor said. Did you look? A pause. Yes. And nothing. He was gone. Completely gone. And then your mother stopped returning calls, and the chapter moved on because that's what you do. Victor stopped. I kept the ring because it was the only thing I had left of something I destroyed. Caleb picked the ring up off the table and turned it between his fingers. It was the same diameter as the replacement he'd used. Identical, actually. Which made sense. His replacement had been taken from a machine shop in El Paso, and the only man he knew of who had done custom work in El Paso with components of this exact specification was a retired fabricator named Caleb's thoughts stopped mid-step and started over. The machine shop in El Paso had belonged to a man named Dell. Old Dell, the workers had called him. He'd cleared out in 2019 and sold the place, and Caleb had picked through the remaining parts for 2 days and paid $20 for a box of precision rings that nobody else had wanted because they didn't fit any standard application. Dell D. Daniel. Caleb put the ring down on the table very carefully. Victor, he said, the machine shop in El Paso, on Piedra Street. Do you know who owned it? Victor frowned. What? A man named Dell, or Daniel, a fabricator who specialized in custom calibration components. Retired about 2019. Victor was looking at him the way a man looks when a conversation has suddenly moved into territory he can't navigate by landmarks. He glanced at Hawk. Hawk had gone completely white. Say that again, Hawk said. Caleb said it again. He said it carefully, naming the street, naming the shop, describing what he knew of the man who'd run it, an older man, from what the remaining workers had told him. A man of few words and extraordinary precision, who had come to El Paso in the early 2000s and set up a small shop and done exceptional work for 2 decades before selling and disappearing again. When he finished, the table was silent for a long time. It was Victor who spoke first. He didn't go far, Victor said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has just understood something that changes everything he thought he understood. And the change is too large to hold without it showing on his face. He went to El Paso. He kept working. Victor stopped. Tried again. He was making the components. Caleb confirmed. Because the only explanation that made sense, the only explanation that accounted for a box of precision calibration rings sitting in a shop in El Paso in 2019. Rings that fit a one-of-a-kind machine built in Arizona in 2001 was that the man who built the machine had spent 2 decades manufacturing the parts that someone might eventually need to fix it. In case someone came looking, in case someone found it. Caleb's chest was so tight he had to consciously tell himself to breathe. His father had not abandoned the motorcycle. His father had not abandoned the work. He had lost everything: the chapter, the woman he loved, the child he was about to have, and he had gone to another city, and he had spent 20 years quietly manufacturing the one component that a 22-year-old kid would eventually pick out of a parts box for $20 without understanding why. Like the machine could tell, like a father could tell. He knew someone would come back for it, Caleb said. He was speaking as much to himself as to either of them. He knew some would eventually find what was wrong and need the part, and he wanted to make sure. He stopped. He looked at Hawk. He wanted to make sure the part existed, he said quietly, even if he couldn't be the one to use it. Hawk put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. He stayed that way for a long time. Victor was looking at the ring that Caleb had set down, the ring he'd kept in his pocket for 20 years, and his face had the particular devastation of a man realizing that the thing he thought he was punishing had spent all that time trying to make amends from a distance he could not close. The music from the speakers filled the silence. Outside, the rain had eased to something quieter, a steady low sound against the walls. No longer angry. Caleb picked up the original calibration ring and put it in his own pocket. Not because he was keeping it. He wasn't sure yet why he did it. Some instinct, some pull toward the thing that spent 20 years in a man's hand as the physical weight of everything he'd done wrong. It felt like something that should be held carefully and intentionally, not left sitting on a table. What happened to her? Caleb said. Victor's sister, Carol. Victor looked at him. The question had caught him sideways. She recovered more than the doctors expected, he said slowly. Not completely, she still has limitations, but she rebuilt her life. She lives in Phoenix now. She has grandchildren. He paused. She never blamed Daniel. She told me that repeatedly, for years. She said it was an accident and she didn't blame him. His voice was rough at the edges. I blamed him anyway, because I needed somewhere to put it. And now, Caleb said. Victor looked down at the table. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. What do you want from me? He said finally. Justice? An accounting? You want me to stand up in front of the chapter and say what I did? I don't know yet what I want, Caleb said honestly. I fixed the motorcycle. I found out my father built it. I found out why it was broken and who broke it. He paused. I want to understand what happened to him. What really happened, not the version where he's a man who walked away. He wasn't a man who walked away, Victor said. Low, heavy. He was a man I drove away, and I have lived with that distinction for 20 years, and I promise you, it is not a comfortable place to live. Hawk reached across the table and picked up the original calibration ring. He turned it in his fingers the way Caleb had. He looked at the initials on the inside of the band D. D, small and precise, and then he set it down again. We need to find Daniel, Hawk said. Both Caleb and Victor looked at him. The shop in El Paso closed, Hawk said, which means he moved again. Which means he's somewhere. He looked at Caleb. And you're here, which means something. Caleb looked at the ring on the table. He thought about 20 years of a man manufacturing components for a machine he could never go back to fix. He thought about $20 and a parts box and a Greyhound bus and an Arizona rainstorm. He thought about a motorcycle that was running tonight for the first time in 2 decades, running on a ring that his father had made with his own hands in a shop 4 states away, a ring that had found its way into his son's toolbox by a route that no reasonable person could call coincidence, and no reasonable person could fully explain. I know someone who might know where he is, Caleb said. They both looked at him. My mother, Caleb said. She told me he was gone. She told me she didn't know where. But she kept his birthday on a calendar every year, and she seemed like a woman who had made a decision, not a woman who had been left. He picked up the ring and held it for a moment. And now I think those are 2 different things. The lamp on the wall behind them hummed steadily. Victor Malone looked at Caleb across the table with 20 years of weight in his face. And for the first time all night, what Caleb saw in the man's eyes was not guilt or calculation or self-protection. It was hope. Small and damaged and unfamiliar from long disuse, but unmistakably, undeniably there. Caleb called his mother at 11:47 p.m. from a phone that Hawk's right-hand man, Eddie, had handed him without a word, a gesture that said more about how the night had shifted than anything anyone in that compound had said directly. He stood in the covered walkway between the 2 buildings and listened to it ring 4 times before she picked up. Caleb. Sandra Dawson's voice had the particular alert quality of a mother who had spent 20 years never fully sleeping, never fully relaxing that one specific muscle in her chest that tensed whenever her son's name appeared on a screen. It's almost midnight. I know, I'm sorry. He wasn't sorry. He needed to ask this question, and he needed to ask it now, before he talked himself into a softer version of it. Mom, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me the truth. A pause. The kind of pause that is itself an answer. Where is he? Caleb said. Where is who? Don't. His voice came out harder than he intended, and he made himself pull it back. Please don't. I'm standing in a compound in Maricopa County. I just spent 2 hours working on a motorcycle that Dad built. I found his signature inside the engine casing. I found a parts shop in El Paso that matches his fabrication style exactly. That was run by a man named Dell for nearly 2 decades. And I ended up here tonight with a toolbox that had components in it that could not have fit this machine by accident." He stopped. "I need to know if you knew." The silence stretched long enough that Caleb heard his own breathing and the distant sound of rain. "Sandra, I knew about the shop," she said finally. "Quietly, not at first. Not for a long time. He contacted me in 2009. Caleb closed his eyes. "He wanted to know about you," she said. "That was the only reason he reached out. He didn't ask about himself, didn't make any case for coming back, didn't try to explain what happened in 2001. He just wanted to know if you were healthy, if you were happy, if you were anything like him." She stopped. "I told him you were taking apart every machine you could get your hands on, and that, yes, that answered his question." "Did you keep talking to him?" "Twice a year. Your birthday and his." She said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed for years and hoped never to have to say. "I want you to understand something, Caleb. He did not leave us. He left the situation he was in because he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the situation had become something that would eventually hurt us more than his absence would. He was protecting us the way men protect people when they think they are the source of the danger. That's not his decision to make." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. And I told him that in 2009 and in 2011 and in 2014. Every time we talked, I told him." She paused. "But he is a very stubborn man with a very strong idea of what the people he loves deserve, and what he had decided they deserved was better than what he thought he could give them." Caleb turned and leaned his back against the wall and tipped his head up and looked at the underside of the corrugated metal roof and thought about 20 years of birthday calls. 20 years of a woman keeping a secret because she had made a decision that the secret was kindness and not concealment. And maybe she had been right, and maybe she had been wrong, and maybe it didn't matter anymore which one it was. "Where is he now?" "Caleb Flagstaff," Sandra said. "He's been there for 4 years. He has a small workshop on the outskirts of town. Does restoration work, old motorcycles, vintage machines." She paused. "He's been in Flagstaff for 4 years, and he never told me why he chose Arizona, but I always thought—" She stopped. "You thought he was circling back," Caleb said. "I thought he was circling back," she confirmed. "The way something does when it doesn't know how to go home directly." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, he could hear the calm, settling voices in the main hall going lower. A few bikes moving, the general sound of a night winding down toward its end. Inside him, something was reorganizing. Not healing, that was too clean a word for what was happening, but reorganizing. The shape of his understanding of his own life was shifting, and the shift was enormous and quiet at the same time. The way geological things are enormous and quiet. "Does he know about tonight?" Caleb asked. "Does he know I'm here?" "No," Sandra said. "He doesn't know where you are. The last time we spoke was 3 weeks ago, and you were in Tucson." "Okay," Caleb straightened up. "I need his number, Mom." Another pause. This one was different, not reluctance, but something closer to relief. Like a woman setting down a weight she had been carrying. For so long she'd stopped noticing it. She gave him the number. When he walked back into the main hall, Hawk and Victor were both still at the table. The 3 men who had been with Victor had quietly relocated to the other end of the room, understanding, without being told, that space was required. Eddie was at the bar and made eye contact with Caleb and raised his chin slightly, the universal language, for asking if everything was all right. And Caleb gave him a nod that wasn't exactly a yes, but meant he was still standing. He sat down. He told them what Sandra had said. He watched Hawk's face go through 3 distinct things: relief, anger at 20 years wasted, and then something that resolved into the specific stillness of a man making a decision. Victor's face did something simpler and harder to watch. His eyes went bright, in a way that a 61-year-old man was clearly not comfortable with. And he looked down at the table and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there for a moment. "So, Flagstaff," Hawk said. "Flagstaff," Caleb confirmed. 3 hours from here." Hawk looked at the clock on the wall. "It's almost midnight, I know. You want to go tonight?" It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered it anyway. Yes. Hawk looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Victor. Victor had lowered his hand from his face and was sitting up straight with the careful posture of a man who has decided to stop accommodating his own grief and start doing something useful with his body. I'm going, Victor said. Hawk said no. Hawk's voice had an edge in it that Caleb had not heard before, not anger exactly, but authority. The kind that doesn't need to be demonstrated because it has already been established over years. You don't show up to that man's door at 2 a.m. before he knows you're coming. Not after what happened. Not after 20 years of silence. You get me? Victor's jaw tightened. Then he nodded. Once. Then you go, he said. You and the boy. That's the plan, Hawk said. Caleb looked between the two of them. Does anyone want to ask if I'm okay with this plan? Hawk looked at him. The edge was gone from his voice when he said, Are you okay with this plan? Caleb thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. He thought about a man in Flagstaff who had spent 20 years manufacturing calibration rings for a motorcycle he couldn't go back to fix, who had relocated to the state where the motorcycle lived without being able to close the last 70 miles, who called a woman twice a year to ask about a son he had never allowed himself to know. Let's go, Caleb said. They took Hawk's personal truck, because Hawk said he wasn't doing a 3-hour drive through a monsoon remnant on a motorcycle, and nobody argued with him. Eddie came out to the lot and handed Hawk a go bag without explanation, the kind of automatic preparation that spoke to years of operating in situations that required flexibility, and stood by the truck door while Hawk climbed in. You want company? Eddie said. Stay here, Hawk said. If Victor tries to leave before morning, sit on him. Eddie looked pained. He's going to be real happy about that. No, he's not. They pulled out of the compound at 5 minutes past midnight. Caleb was in the passenger seat with his toolbox wedged between his feet because he hadn't been willing to put it in the truck bed in the rain, and Hawk hadn't asked him to. He had the phone number his mother had given him in his hand, written on the back of a receipt from Eddie's jacket pocket. He had not called it yet. They were 40 minutes north of the compound, the highway dark and wet and almost empty, when Hawk said, You're not going to call ahead. Caleb looked at the number. No, why not? Because I've thought about having a father for 20 years, Caleb said. And I'm afraid if I call first, he'll spend the drive here talking himself out of what he knows he owes. He paused. I want to see his face when he opens the door. I need to see it. I need to know immediately whether this is a man who is going to be honest with me. Hawk didn't say anything to that. He drove, and the road unspooled ahead of them, and the rain had dropped to a mist that the wipers handled with one slow arc every few seconds. After a while, Hawk said, He was honest with me. Always. In the years I knew him, Daniel was the most straight-ahead man I ever met. He said what he meant. He did what he said. When he made a mistake, he looked at it directly. A pause. The accident with Victor's sister, he came to me the same week he found out the connection. He didn't try to bury it. He said, Hawk, I caused damage and I need to make it right and I don't know how. And I told him to start by talking to Victor and let it go from there. Another pause. Longer. I didn't know Victor was going to react the way he reacted. I didn't know what Victor was going to do. Do you think my father knew? Caleb said. That Victor took the ring? Hawk considered it. I've been sitting with that question for the last hour, he said. And I think yes. I think he probably figured it out, or suspected it. Which means when he left, he was protecting the chapter as much as he was protecting himself. If he'd accused Victor directly, it would have torn the brotherhood apart. Victor was well-loved, well-established. A confrontation would have forced people to choose sides, and no matter who won, the chapter lost. He shook his head. So he left, and he took the conflict with him. Caleb sat with that. He turned the receipt over in his fingers. He sacrificed his life here to keep the peace. He was always like that, Hawk said quietly. Too much conscience for his own good sometimes. The kind of man who feels other people's costs the same way he feels his own. The highway opened up as they left the Phoenix Metro behind, and the truck moved faster, with less traffic to navigate. The mist had thinned, and the sky had the washed, clear quality it gets after a long rain, and the first stars were showing through in patches. Caleb called Sandra back at 1 a.m. and asked her one more thing, the specific address. She gave it without hesitation, which told him she'd had it memorized for years, probably the same way she had his father's birthday memorized, stored in some part of her mind that she maintained carefully and never talked about. The address was a workshop on a county road 6 miles outside Flagstaff. There was apparently a small residence attached to the rear of the building. Sandra said he kept early hours workshop, opened at 6 in the morning, usually went dark by 9 at night. He'll be asleep, she said. I know, Caleb said. He won't mind, she said. And then, Caleb. Yeah, he has your photograph from your high school graduation. I don't know how he got it. I didn't send it. I always thought maybe your Aunt Renee. But he has it. He mentioned it once. She paused. I'm telling you that so you know that whatever distance he put between himself and you, it wasn't indifference. You understand? Caleb's throat was tight again. Yeah, Mom. I understand. He ended the call and stared out the windshield for a while without speaking. Hawk didn't push. There was something in the man's manner that Caleb had started to understand, a quality of holding space, of being physically present without demanding emotional access. It was the quality of someone who had learned, through long experience, when to ride alongside and when to let a man sit with his own road. They reached the county road outside Flagstaff at 3:15 in the morning. The workshop was dark, as expected. A single security light above the main door threw a yellow circle on the gravel lot. There were 2 vehicles in the lot, a work truck and an older sedan, and along the side of the building, beneath a canvas overhang, sat 4 motorcycles in various stages of restoration. Even in the dark, and from a distance, Caleb could tell the work was extraordinary. The quality of attention visible in the way the machines were positioned, covered, cared for. It was the same quality he'd felt in the calibration system, in the secondary housing, in every fingerprint his father had left on the $2.5 million Harley. Hawk killed the headlights and let the truck idle. You want me to come? He said. Caleb looked at the building. He thought about going up to that door alone, a 22-year-old kid in worn boots with grease on his hands, knocking at 3 in the morning on the door of a man who had spent 20 years being his father at a distance. He thought about what he wanted from this moment and whether he could handle whatever came back at him. Give me 10 minutes, he said. If the light doesn't come on in 10 minutes, come knock. He got out of the truck. The gravel was wet underfoot, and the air at this elevation had a different quality than Phoenix, colder, thinner, cleaner. He crossed the lot without hurrying. He found the door at the rear of the building that would lead to the residence, and he knocked. Once, twice, silence. He knocked again, harder. A light came on inside. The yellow warmth of it spread through the gap at the bottom of the door, and Caleb heard movement, footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, the movement of a man who had decided, before he reached the door, to be calm about whatever was on the other side of it. The door opened. Daniel Dawson was 53 years old and looked like what Caleb would look like in 30 years if he kept working with his hands and stopped sleeping enough. The same jaw, the same forehead, the eyes were darker, and there were 20 years more weight in them, and his hair had gone silver at the temples in a way that Caleb's hadn't yet, but none of that mattered, because when the man looked at him, it was with immediate, total recognition, the kind that had nothing to do with photographs and everything to do with something older than photographs. He knew his son. He knew him the same instant Caleb knew him. Neither of them said anything for 3 full seconds. Daniel Dawson stood in his doorway in a gray t-shirt and work pants, clearly pulled on in a hurry, and he looked at Caleb the way a man looks at something he has wanted for so long that the wanting became its own permanent condition, a background state he stopped consciously registering, and now the thing was here and real and standing in his gravel lot at 3 in the morning, and the wanting, the having, were the same thing suddenly, and that reconciliation was visibly enormous and visibly devastating. Caleb, Daniel said, just that. His name. Hi, Caleb said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He was grateful for that. Daniel stepped back from the door. Caleb went through. The residence was small and intensely organized, the kind of order that a solitary person develops over years. Everything with a place, nothing extraneous. The front room had a workbench along one wall with a lamp over it, and tools arranged with the specific deliberateness of someone who spent a lot of time alone with their hands and needed to know exactly where everything was. On the bench, a vintage carburetor was partially disassembled and laid out in sequence. On the wall above the bench, between a technical diagram and a shelf of machine manuals, was a photograph. Caleb stopped when he saw it. It was his high school graduation photo. The one his Aunt Renee had taken in her backyard in Albuquerque. The one where he was squinting slightly because the sun was in his eyes and he was holding his diploma in one hand and a socket wrench in the other because he'd been working on Renee's Civic that morning and had forgotten to put it down before the picture started. He had no memory of that photo ever being sent anywhere. He looked at it on the wall of his father's home in Flagstaff and understood, for the first time, completely, what his mother had been trying to tell him on the phone. "Sit down," Daniel said. He was already moving to the kitchen area, filling a kettle, doing something with his hands because he needed to. "I'll make coffee." "It's 3:15 in the morning," Caleb said. "I know." "Sit down anyway." Caleb sat. He put his elbows on the table and looked at this man he did not know and knew completely, and tried to locate himself within the feeling, which was not one feeling but approximately 7 simultaneously. He settled on the one that was closest to the surface, which was the one that was the least comfortable, which was the one that was the most honest. "The Harley is running," Caleb said. Daniel went very still at the counter. "I fixed it tonight," Caleb continued. "I used one of the precision rings from your El Paso shop. It fit." Daniel turned around slowly. The kettle was heating, but he had stopped moving, stopped doing anything. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was past surprise. He was somewhere in the territory that comes after the last wall comes down and there's nothing left to manage. "How did you know about the rings?" he said. "I didn't. Not until tonight." Caleb put the original calibration ring on the table. Victor's ring. The one that had lived in a man's vest pocket for 20 years. Victor Malone had this. He took it in April 2001. "He told me everything tonight." Daniel looked at the ring for a long time. He sat down across from Caleb, the coffee forgotten, the kettle beginning to make small sounds on the counter, and he picked up the ring and turned it in his fingers the way Caleb had turned it in his, the way Hawk had turned it, the way all three of them had handled it tonight, like the weight of it was important to acknowledge physically. "He told you," Daniel said. "He told me about Carol, about the accident, about why he took it." Caleb paused. "He's been carrying it for 20 years. He's in bad shape about it." "He should be," Daniel said. Then, immediately, "I don't mean that the way it sounds." "How do you mean it?" Daniel set the ring down. "I mean that Victor is a man who feels things deeply and acts on them too quickly, and he always has been. And the fact that he's been in bad shape about it means he knows what he did and that he has enough conscience to be hurt by it." He looked at Caleb. "I was never angry at Victor the way he deserved. I understood why he did it. I understood it too well. If someone had put Daniel Dawson's sister in a hospital, I might have done something worse." "You left instead," Caleb said. "I left because I was the problem," Daniel said. "I know how that sounds. I know how convenient it sounds. But the reality was that Victor's anger was going to either destroy the chapter or destroy him, and the only variable I could actually control was my own presence." He stopped. "And I genuinely told myself that it would be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. Long enough for Victor to grieve, for Carol to stabilize, for things to settle. And then I would come back and I would fix the bike and I would explain everything and it would be." "But you didn't come back," Caleb said. "No." Daniel's voice was flat on that word, the flatness of a man who has no excuse that satisfies him and has stopped trying to construct one. "Because 6 months became a year and a year became 3. And by then your mother had built a life and you were walking and talking, and there was a version of your story that didn't have me in it, and I convinced myself that introducing myself into that story would do more damage than staying out." He looked at Caleb directly. "I was wrong. I know that. I knew it probably by the time you were 5, but I was 3 years into being wrong by then, and I couldn't figure out how to stop. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The kettle had begun to whistle softly. Why Arizona? Caleb said. What? You went to El Paso first. Then you came to Flagstaff 4 years ago. Why come back to Arizona specifically? Daniel stood up and went to the kettle and turned it off and stood with his back to Caleb for a moment. Because I'm not a brave man, he said. I'm a man who can almost do things. I can get as far as Flagstaff. I can drive past the county line. He stopped. I drove to the Maricopa compound once, about 2 years ago. 3 in the morning. I sat in the lot for 20 minutes. Caleb stared at his father's back. I couldn't go in, Daniel said. He turned around. I told myself it was too late, that too much time had passed, that walking back in there at 51 years old would be, I don't know, reopening something that had healed. He sat back down across from Caleb. I was wrong about that too. You were wrong about a lot, Caleb said. Yes. I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry, Caleb said. Because I am. I've been angry my whole life, and I didn't know what at. I just carried it around like a weight that didn't have a name, and now it has a name, and yes, I'm angry. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. But I also drove 3 hours tonight specifically to sit across from you. So anger is apparently not the only thing I am. Daniel looked at him. His eyes were not wet, exactly, but close to it, in the way that some men get close to something and then manage it with everything they have, because they have a long history of managing. No, Daniel said quietly. I imagine it's not. Hawk is outside, Caleb said. In the truck. He's been waiting. Something happened in Daniel's face at that name. 20 years of absence and grief and deliberate distance, and the sound of that name still moved something visibly. Jackson's here? He drove me. He wanted to come himself. Daniel stood up again, this time without the pretense of doing something at the counter. He just stood. Caleb watched him process the information. Hawk Morrison, outside 3 hours from the compound, in the middle of the night, waiting in a truck while his son sat in this kitchen. He watched his father understand what that meant, what all of this meant, what tonight was. He came for me, Daniel said. He came for the motorcycle, Caleb said. And then it turned into this. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. He went to the window and looked out at the lot, and Caleb could see in his posture the straightening, the breath drawn, and held the exact moment his father decided to stop being a man who got as far as Flagstaff. I need to get my jacket, Daniel said. Okay, Caleb said. And I need 5 minutes. Take 10, Caleb said. Daniel went to the back of the residence. Caleb stayed at the table and looked at the photograph on the wall, himself at 18, squinting, holding a diploma and a socket wrench, and felt the 7 simultaneous feelings arrange themselves slowly into something closer to one. He took out his phone and called Eddie at the compound. It rang twice. Kid, Eddie said, not bothering with hello. Go get Victor Malone, Caleb said. Don't let him say no. A pause. You found him? I found him. Victor needs to be here when we get back. Can you do that? I can do that, Eddie said. Good. Caleb ended the call. He looked at the calibration ring on the table. Then he picked it up and held it for a moment. D. D, stamped small and precise into the metal. A man's initials pressed into the thing he built and the thing that had been taken from him and that had spent 20 years in a pocket and was now in a kitchen in Flagstaff, being held by the son who had never known the man who made it. He put the ring in his pocket. Outside, the truck's headlights came on. Hawk, after 15 minutes, deciding he'd waited long enough. Caleb heard the truck door open and footsteps on gravel, and then a knock on the residence door, different from his own earlier knock, heavier. Daniel came back from the rear of the residence wearing a jacket. He stopped when he heard the knock. He looked at Caleb. That's him, Caleb said. Daniel Dawson crossed the room and opened the door. Jackson Morrison stood on the threshold, and the two men looked at each other across 20 years of silence and absence, and a motorcycle that had run tonight for the first time since the last night they'd been in the same room together. Hawk's face had that contained quality again, the quality of a man managing a very large thing very carefully. Daniel's face had the quality of a man who had stopped managing and was letting whatever was true be visible. You look old, Hawk said. You look like you drove 3 hours in the rain, Daniel said. I did, Hawk said. And then the two men, the chapter president who had never stopped waiting for the friend who built the most extraordinary motorcycle any of them had ever seen, and the mechanic who had spent 20 years getting close enough to come home, but not all the way there, stood in a doorway in Flagstaff at 3:30 in the morning and did something that neither of them would have used the word for. But that was unmistakably what it was. Caleb watched from the table. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He thought about a $20 box of parts in a machine shop in El Paso. He thought about an Arizona rainstorm and a gate latch and an engine firing in the dark after 20 years of silence. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone saying he was circling back and about the particular quality of things that orbit what they cannot quite reach. He thought, this is what it looks like when the orbit closes. What he felt sitting at a kitchen table in Flagstaff while his father and the man who had spent 20 years keeping the motorcycle waiting stood in a doorway and found their way back to each other was something large and steady and warm. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a precise name in English, but that you know immediately when it arrives, because everything in you that has been held tight lets go all at once. But the warmth lasted only as long as it took for Daniel to step back from Hawk and say, with a different tone, a careful tone, the tone of a man who has just remembered something that the reunion almost made him forget. Hawk, we need to talk. Before we go anywhere, we need to talk about why I really left. Hawk's expression shifted. You said it was the situation with Victor. That's part of it, Daniel said. Victor and Carol, that was real, and it was part of it. But there was something else. Something I found out 3 weeks before I left. He looked at Hawk steadily. Something about the motorcycle. About who wanted it and why. About why I built the calibration system the way I built it with the secondary housing. With the signature, with the components that I spent 20 years manufacturing in a shop in El Paso. He paused. I built it that way because I knew even in 2001 that someone was going to need to find it. Caleb stood up from the table. What are you talking about? Hawk said. The motorcycle was never just a motorcycle, Daniel said. I built it as a record, a document. There are things hidden in that machine in the calibration system, in the housing design, in the sequence of modifications that are encoded information. Evidence. He stopped. Evidence of something that was happening in the chapter in 2001. Something I uncovered by accident. Something that certain people in that compound and outside of it had every reason to make disappear. He looked at Caleb, and what was in his eyes now was not grief or guilt or the complex emotion of reunion. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for a long time to hand something dangerous to someone strong enough to carry it. Evidence that is still relevant. Evidence that can still do damage to people who are still active. The room went very quiet. And the reason I built it into the machine, Daniel said, is because I knew they would never destroy the motorcycle. They would sabotage it. They would keep it from running. But they would never destroy it because destroying it would raise questions they didn't want raised. Hawk's voice had gone very low. Daniel, what did you find? I'll tell you everything, Daniel said. But I need you to understand what I'm going to tell you is going to change things in that compound significantly. And there's no putting it back once it's out. He looked at his son. I need to know you're both ready for that. Caleb looked at his father, the man he had never known, who had spent 20 years getting as far as Flagstaff and no further, who had built a machine full of secrets and manufactured the parts to unlock it from 3 states away, who had a photograph of his son on the wall and had called his son's mother twice a year for 16 years and had sat in a parking lot at 3 in the morning, unable to close the last 70 miles. Tell us, Caleb said, and Daniel Dawson sat down at the table with his son and his oldest friend in a kitchen in Flagstaff at 3:30 in the morning and began to speak. Daniel talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He talked the way a man talks when he has rehearsed something in his head for 20 years and finally has the room and the audience and the specific courage that only arrives when there is nothing left to protect, not reputation, not distance, not the careful architecture of absence he had built around himself like a second skin. He talked, and Caleb sat across from him and did not interrupt once. And Hawk stood near the wall with his arms crossed and his face doing things that Caleb watched from the corner of his eye, because Hawk's face was a kind of secondary document confirming or complicating every sentence Daniel spoke. It started in the spring of 2001, 6 weeks before Daniel disappeared. He had been working late, which was ordinary. He always worked late in those final months. The calibration system was in its last phase, and he was sleeping 4 hours a night and spending the rest of it in the garage. Everyone in the compound knew his schedule. Everyone knew the garage was his between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., which was why, on the night of April 3rd, whoever entered the garage at 2 in the morning did not expect to find him there. Daniel had been under the motorcycle, working on the underside of the secondary housing, when he heard the side door open. He heard 2 voices he recognized and a third he didn't. He heard the word shipment and the word untraceable, and he heard a number 340,000 spoken in the flat, transactional tone that people use when money is a tool rather than an amount. He stayed under the motorcycle and did not move. The 3 men were in the garage for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Daniel Dawson heard enough to understand that 2 senior members of the Maricopa chapter, men with rank, men with influence, men who had been in the club for decades, were running a financial operation through the chapter's legitimate business accounts that had nothing to do with motorcycles or brotherhood or anything the organization publicly stood for. He heard names. He heard account numbers, spoken partially, enough to be identifying. He heard the name of a contact in Phoenix who was facilitating the movement of money through 3 shell businesses. The third voice, the one he didn't recognize, belonged to someone who was not a member, someone from outside. When the side door closed and the garage went quiet, Daniel lay under the motorcycle for another 10 minutes and did not move. He was running the calculation that people run when they have accidentally learned something that changes the nature of every relationship they have. The calculation is always the same, and the variables are always the same. How dangerous is this information? Who does it endanger? And what happens to the people I love if I am the one holding it? He came to the same conclusion most people come to when they run that calculation, honestly. He was in serious trouble. Hawk's arms had dropped from his crossed position while Daniel talked. He was standing straight now, very still, with an expression that had moved through 3 stages: disbelief, recognition, and then the hard, specific anger of a man who understands that something corrupt has been living inside something he trusted and loved. The 2 members, Hawk said. He said it slowly, carefully. Tell me it wasn't Briggs and Tolliver, Daniel said. Hawk closed his eyes for 1 second, just one. Then he opened them, and his jaw was set in a way that Caleb had not seen on him before, a way that explained very clearly how the man had maintained authority over a chapter for 20-plus years. Gerald Briggs, Hawk said. And Ray Tolliver, Daniel confirmed. Briggs has been dead for 8 years, Hawk said. I know, I kept track. Tolliver is still. Hawk stopped. His voice had a quality in it that was dangerous, in the specific way that very controlled things are dangerous. Ray Tolliver is still an active member of this chapter. The kitchen held that information for a moment. Caleb looked at his father. You built the evidence into the motorcycle. I had no other option, Daniel said. I couldn't go to the police. I had no hard documentation, only what I'd heard. And the word of an outsider mechanic against 2 senior members with long tenure would have gone nowhere and would have gotten me killed in the process. He leaned forward. I couldn't confront Hawk directly because I didn't know yet who else was involved, how far up it went, whether the compound itself was compromised at a level that made any internal conversation dangerous. I needed time. I needed to make what I knew permanent and hidden and retrievable by the right person. So you hid it in the machine, Caleb said. The calibration system has 7 distinct encoding chambers, Daniel said. I designed them that way intentionally. Each chamber in the secondary housing corresponds to a set of information. Account numbers, names, dates, the name of the outside contact. He looked at Hawk. The information is encoded in the mechanical dimensions of the chambers themselves, the precise measurements. The calibration ratios. You'd need the blueprint to read it, and the blueprint was never written down. It exists in the machine itself. You're telling me, Hawk said slowly, that the evidence against Tolliver has been sitting in my garage for 20 years. Under 3 lights on a raised platform, Daniel said. Yes. Hawk made a sound that was not a word. Why didn't you send the blueprint, Caleb said, even anonymously? Why didn't you find a way to get it to someone? I tried. Daniel's voice went flat on those 2 words. In 2004, I sent a partial schematic to a lawyer in Tucson with instructions to pass it to federal law enforcement if anything happened to me. He died in 2006 car accident, unrelated, and his files were absorbed into a general archive. In 2008, I made contact with an investigator I thought I could trust. He was on Tolliver's payroll. I found that out 48 hours before our scheduled meeting, and I moved the El Paso shop to a new address and went quiet for 2 years. He looked at his hands. And then I realized the only real protection I had was obscurity. As long as I stayed invisible, the information in the motorcycle was safe. As long as I stayed away, Tolliver had no reason to touch it. His voice dropped. But the machine couldn't run, and I couldn't fix it without coming back. And coming back was too dangerous, Caleb said. Was too dangerous, Daniel confirmed. Or that's what I told myself. For 20 years, that's what I told myself. The truth of that sat in the room with the weight of 20 years behind it. Caleb looked at his father and thought about Flagstaff. About a parking lot at 3 in the morning. About a man who got as far as 70 miles and stopped because coming back was too dangerous, was an explanation that had kept itself valid by never being tested. What changed, Caleb said. Why did you come to Flagstaff? Why now? Daniel looked at him. You, he said simply. Your mother told me in our last call that you'd left Tucson heading north. She didn't know where. She said you had your toolbox and no fixed plan and that you'd been talking about Arizona. He paused. I came to Flagstaff because I couldn't be in New Mexico, knowing you were moving toward the same compound I'd been circling for 20 years, and not be stopped. Found a different word. Present. Caleb said nothing. What was in him at that moment was too large and too complicated for a sentence. Hawk pushed off the wall. He was moving now the way men move when they have received information that requires action and the time for sitting has ended. The encoding in the calibration chambers, he said. You said you need the blueprint to read it. How do we access it? I carry the blueprint, Daniel said. He touched his temple. In here. I've gone over it so many times in 20 years that I could reconstruct it exactly. We need access to the motorcycle's secondary housing and a precision measurement tool, a digital micrometer. Calibrated, and I can translate the encoded dimensions into the original documentation within a few hours. We need to go back, Hawk said. Yes, tonight, Daniel agreed. Hawk looked at Caleb. Caleb was already standing up. He picked up his toolbox, which had been sitting by the kitchen table since he came in, and picked up the calibration ring from where it lay beside the coffee cups and looked at his father. Can you drive? Caleb said. I can drive, Daniel said. Then let's go. They were back on the southbound highway by 4:15 in the morning. Daniel drove his own truck. Hawk rode with him in the passenger seat, and Caleb sat in the back with his toolbox and watched the 2 men in the front seats, the chapter president and the mechanic who had been his ghost for 20 years, navigate their way back into the same space without either of them being able to fully name what they were doing. It looked like ordinary conversation. It looked like 2 men catching up. But underneath it, Caleb could feel the weight of 2 decades being processed in real time, sorted and filed and incorporated by 2 people who had both been holding a version of events that was true but incomplete. He listened and said nothing and watched the dark highway move under them. Halfway back, Hawk called Eddie. What's the status? Hawk said. Victor is here, Eddie said through the phone. He's not happy about it, but he's here. Him and about 15 other guys who were still in the hall when I brought him in from the parking lot. A pause. Word is spreading, Hawk. The bike ran tonight. Everyone knows about the bike. There are guys who drove over from the East chapter because they heard. And I don't know how to say this exactly. There's a feeling in this place. Like something is about to happen. Something is about to happen, Hawk said. Is Ray Tolliver in the building? A silence on the other end, different from the previous silences. Yeah, Eddie said carefully. He came in about an hour ago. Said he heard about the bike and wanted to see it himself. Hawk's voice didn't change. Keep him there. Don't tell him anything. Don't let him in the garage. Hawk, keep him there. Eddie, he ended the call. Daniel had heard everything. He was driving and looking at the road, and his hands on the wheel were steady. But Caleb could see the muscle in his jaw working. He's there, Daniel said. Not a question. He's there, Hawk confirmed. He heard about the bike running. Yes, which means he's trying to figure out what it means. Whether anyone got into the secondary housing, whether the encoding was found. Daniel's voice was controlled. He's not there to celebrate. He's there to assess the damage. I know that, Hawk said. If he figures out what the calibration system contains before we can access and document it, Daniel. Hawk's voice was steady. I've been running this chapter for over 20 years. I have handled problems of every variety. You let me worry about Tolliver. He paused. You just read me the blueprint. The compound was louder than Caleb expected at 5 in the morning. The lot had twice as many bikes as when they'd left. And as the three of them came through the main gate, Caleb could see lights in both buildings and hear the collective sound of a large group of people in a state of charged anticipation. Word of the motorcycle had done what stories of extraordinary things always do. It had traveled fast and pulled people in from the surrounding gravity. Eddie met them at the side door of the garage. He looked at Daniel Dawson, and his face went through a sequence of emotions that he compressed into about 2 seconds before settling on the professionalism of a man who had learned to process surprises quickly. Daniel, he said. Eddie, Daniel said, good to see you. Man, he said it simply and meant it. Then he looked at Hawk. Victor is in the main hall. Tolliver is at the bar with 3 of his guys. He asked twice about the secondary housing, and I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Good. Hawk turned to Caleb. I need 30 minutes in the garage with Daniel. Can you handle Victor? Caleb looked at him. Handle him how? He doesn't know what the encoding contains. He doesn't know why Daniel left. He only knows what we told him tonight about the ring and Carol. He's sitting in that hall with 20 years of guilt and a partial picture. Hawk paused. He needs the full picture before this goes any further. He's going to be part of what happens next, whether we plan for it or not, and I'd rather he have the truth in his hands than be blindsided when it comes out. You want me to tell him, Caleb said. You're the right person, Hawk said. He knows you. Hawk chose the word carefully. He's been working on how to be honest with you all night. Use that. Caleb thought about Victor Malone at that table in the main hall, the 61-year-old man with the gray-white hair and the 20 years of weight and the ring he'd kept in his pocket like a penance. He thought about what it was going to take to tell that man that the damage he'd caused was larger than he knew, that his act of grief-fueled sabotage had not just broken a machine and driven away a friend, it had left a young man's father isolated and unable to come home for 2 decades, while evidence of serious criminal activity sat encoded in a motorcycle in a garage. He thought, this is going to be a hard conversation. Then he thought, most of the important ones are. Okay, Caleb said. Victor was at a table by himself in the main hall. The other men in the room had given him a buffer of empty chairs, not out of hostility, but out of the instinctive respect that groups give to a person who is visibly in the middle of something serious. He was holding a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting long enough to go cold, and he looked up when Caleb came in with the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting and trying not to show it. He's here, isn't he? Victor said. Caleb sat down across from him. He's in the garage. Victor absorbed that. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. He stopped, tried again. How is he? He's okay. He looks older, but he's okay. Caleb paused. He has a photograph of you on his wall. You and him and Hawk from what looks like about 1,999. Something in Victor broke slightly at that. Just slightly a tremor in the face that he got under control in about a second. We were close, he said. We were genuinely close. I know. Caleb leaned forward. Victor, I need to tell you some things. Some of them are going to be hard to hear, and none of them are things you could have known. But you need to know them now, because in about 30 minutes, this is going to become a larger situation, and you need to be standing in the right place when it does. Victor looked at him steadily. Tell me. So Caleb told him. He told him about the night in April 2001, the two voices, and the third, the word shipment and untraceable, and the number 340,000. He told him about the encoding in the calibration chambers, about Briggs and Tolliver, about the shell businesses and the outside contact. He told him about the lawyer in Tucson who died in 2006 and the investigator in 2008 who was on Tolliver's payroll. He told him about 20 years of obscurity as the only available protection, about Flagstaff and the parking lot and the 70 miles that his father had been unable to close. He told it plain and he told it fast, and he watched Victor Malone receive each piece of it. By the time he finished, Victor's coffee cup was on the table, and both his hands were flat beside it, and his face had the look of a man who has just understood the full geometry of his own mistake, not just the shape of it as he had known it, which was bad enough, but the shadow it cast, which extended far beyond what he had seen. He couldn't come back, Victor said. He said it very quietly. Not because of me, not primarily because of me, because coming back meant confronting Tolliver, and confronting Tolliver without documentation, without protection, would have gotten him killed, Caleb said. And I took the one thing that could have helped him come back sooner. Victor's voice was barely above a conversation now. He was looking at the table. If I hadn't taken the ring, if the motorcycle had run, if someone had gotten into the secondary housing in 2002, 2003, Daniel could have come back years earlier. The evidence could have been documented years earlier. He stopped. Tolliver could have been exposed years earlier. Yes, Caleb said. Victor was quiet for a long time. I need to talk to Daniel, he said. You'll get to. But right now I need to ask you something. Caleb met his eyes. Ray Tolliver is at the bar 50 feet from here. He knows the bike ran. He's trying to figure out how much has been found. How well do you know him? Victor's expression changed, hardened. Well enough. If he figures out what's in the housing, before Hawk and my father can document and secure it, what does he do? Victor looked at him. He runs, he said. He's been in that chapter for 23 years, and he has connections and resources that would take 6 months to fully trace. If he has enough warning, he disappears. He paused. And he takes whatever he needs to take with him. Then he can't get warning, Caleb said. And he can't leave. Not until Hawk is ready. Victor straightened in his chair. He had the quality now of a man who has been given a specific task in the middle of his own grief, and who is grateful for it, grateful for the clarity of it, the way it organizes the next 30 minutes of his life. I'll handle Tolliver, he said. Victor, I'll handle him. His voice had the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly what he is capable of and is choosing to be useful with it. I'll keep him in conversation. I'll keep him at the bar. He trusts me. He has no reason not to. I've never given him one. He paused. I'll give Daniel and Hawk the time they need. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. In the garage, Daniel worked with a digital micrometer that Hawk had retrieved from the supply cabinet and a notebook that Eddie produced from somewhere, and the two of them moved through the calibration system chamber by chamber while Caleb stood inside the door and watched and listened to the main hall for anything that needed his attention. Daniel called the measurements, and Hawk wrote them down, and the translation process was slow and precise and utterly unlike the chaos of the preceding hours, a quiet, technical procedure happening in the center of a story that had been anything but quiet or technical. Chamber 3, Daniel said. Outer diameter 47.338 millimeters. Inner diameter 31.204. Ratio differential 0.472. Hawk wrote it down. That translates to account prefix 774, institution code Sonoran First National, routing identifier, and on it went. 40 minutes. 8 chambers, numbers and names and dates that Daniel had memorized with the specific fixity of someone who understood that the memorization was the only thing standing between this information and its permanent loss. When they finished, Hawk had 4 pages of notes in his own handwriting. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, Tolliver. Yes, Daniel said. Briggs is dead, which means Tolliver is the active exposure. Yes. And the outside contact, the facilitator in Phoenix. Is he still active? I don't know. I've been tracking Tolliver for 20 years, but I lost the thread on the Phoenix contact around 2015. Daniel paused. The account information will lead investigators there. It's not a dead end, just a longer road. Hawk folded the notes and put them inside his vest. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, the look of a man reconciling the friend he had with the 20 years that had passed and the information that now sat in his jacket. You should have told me in 2001, he said. You should have come to me directly. I didn't know how far up it went, Daniel said. I didn't know if you were. I know. Hawk's voice was not angry. It was tired. I know why you didn't. I'm not accusing. Daniel, I want you to know that I would have. He stopped. It doesn't matter what I would have done. What matters is what we do now. What do we do now? Daniel asked. Hawk looked at the folded notes in his vest. We go through the legitimate channels. My attorney first tonight, or as soon as he picks up his phone. Then federal, not local. Local law enforcement has too many potential cross-connections to Tolliver's network. He paused. And we do it before Tolliver decides the risk has gotten too high and starts thinking about ways to reduce his exposure. He'll deny everything, Daniel said. He'll try. But you were there. You heard specific account numbers, specific names, a specific dollar amount. And that information has been sitting encoded in a machine that was built in 2001 and which you can prove you designed. The encoding itself is documentation of when you obtained the information. It dates to the construction of the motorcycle. Hawk paused. It's not perfect, but it's a real foundation. The side door opened and Eddie leaned in. Hawk, you need to come out. His voice had a quality in it. Hawk moved immediately. Daniel moved with him. Caleb was already at the door. In the short corridor between the garage and the main hall, Eddie stopped them. He looked at all three of them and then settled on Hawk. Tolliver is asking to see the bike, he said. Victor's been holding him at the bar for 40 minutes, but he just told Victor he needs to see the secondary housing. He's saying he wants to understand the calibration system. Eddie paused. He knows. Maybe not everything, but he knows enough to know he needs to look. Hawk and Daniel exchanged a look. Victor can't hold him much longer without it becoming obvious, Eddie continued. And there are enough people in that hall that if Tolliver decides to push, he's not going in the garage, Hawk said flatly. Hawk, he is not going in that garage. He turned to Daniel. The notes in my vest. Is that enough to start a federal inquiry? It's enough to open an investigation, Daniel said. It's not enough to guarantee prosecution. For that, you'd want the original documentation from the shell businesses, Caleb said. He had been listening to everything. Tolliver would have records. Account records, communication records. 23 years of operation, even if he's been careful. There's paper somewhere. Hawk looked at him. Yes, then he looked at Eddie. Get me a phone. A different one. Who are you calling? Daniel asked. A man in Tucson who doesn't work for Ray Tolliver, Hawk said. He said it without irony and without drama, just the flat certainty of someone who has operated in complex situations for long enough to maintain contingency relationships. A federal contact I've been sitting on for 6 years, hoping I would never need. He took the phone Eddie produced. Go be present in the main hall, he told Caleb and Daniel. Both of you. I need Tolliver to see Daniel. I need him to understand that the picture has changed and that running is no longer the clean option he thinks it is. Can you do that? Caleb looked at his father. Daniel Dawson looked back at his son, the 22-year-old who had walked through an iron gate in a rainstorm 6 hours ago and had not stopped moving since, who had his toolbox with him and grease in the creases of his knuckles and the kind of steadiness in his eyes that a father might spend years hoping a son would develop. Yes, Daniel said. He was looking at Caleb when he said it. They went into the main hall together. The room was fuller than it had been. 40 people, maybe more. And the quality of energy in it had changed. It had the specific, drawn breath quality of a group of people who know something is happening, but don't know yet what it is. Victor was still at the bar with Ray Tolliver, And when Caleb came through the door, he got his first direct look at the man who had spent 23 years building something rotten inside something the people in this room loved. Tolliver was 60-something, compact, with the careful grooming of a man who understood the value of appearing unremarkable. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away, not because he was unintelligent, but because he had spent decades practicing the art of looking like what people expected him to look like. He was laughing at something Victor had said when Caleb and Daniel came through the door, and the laugh stopped. Not gradually, immediately. He saw Daniel Dawson the way a man sees the thing he has most feared, seeing with a recognition so fast and total that the management doesn't kick in quickly enough. And for one raw second, his face said everything it had been carefully not saying for 23 years. Victor saw it. Victor looked at Tolliver's face, and then looked at Daniel, and then looked back at Tolliver. And in that sequence of looks, Caleb watched Victor Malone arrive at a final understanding of the full shape of what he had been a peripheral part of, not complicit in, not knowingly, but adjacent to, in a way that his act of sabotage had prolonged and protected without his knowledge. Victor stood up from his bar stool. He was a big man, and he stood up in the way that big men with long history and a specific kind of purpose stand up, and Tolliver read it immediately for what it was. "Victor," Tolliver said. His voice was still controlled. "What's going on?" "Sit down, Ray," Victor said. His voice had none of the grief and complexity of the last few hours in it. It was clean, simple. The voice of a man who has made a decision. "We're going to wait right here." "Wait for what?" Victor looked at him. "Sit down," Victor said again. The room had gone very quiet. Not the aggressive quiet of a confrontation, but the attentive quiet of people who understand that something important is being settled without fully understanding what it is. Tolliver looked at Daniel Dawson across the room. He looked at him for a long time with the calculating stillness of a man running options and finding each one closed. He looked at Caleb standing beside Daniel. He looked at the garage door, which was closed, and at Eddie, who's positioned near it with the relaxed alertness of someone who was not going to move from that position regardless of what was asked of him. He sat down, and Daniel Dawson, who had spent 20 years in El Paso and Flagstaff manufacturing calibration rings for a motorcycle he couldn't go back to fix, who had encoded the truth into the dimensions of a machine and trusted that someone would eventually come, stood in the middle of the main hall of the Maricopa Hells Angels compound at 5:30 in the morning and looked at the man who had made 2 decades of his absence necessary. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. The motorcycle was running. The encoding had been read. The notes were in Hawk's vest, and Hawk was in a corridor with a phone. Victor Malone was between Tolliver and the door, and every man in that room, without being told the specific facts, understood enough from the weight of the moment to stay where they were. Caleb stood beside his father. He had arrived here 6 hours ago in a rainstorm with a toolbox and nowhere to sleep. He was still standing, in the same boots and the same grease-covered jacket, and he had never in his life been more awake or more certain that exactly this was where he was supposed to be. His father put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, firmly. The hand of a man who had practiced this gesture in his head for 20 years without ever being sure he would get to perform it. Caleb did not move away. He stood exactly where he was, in the room where his father had built the most extraordinary machine any of them had ever seen. In the compound, where everything had broken apart and everything was now, carefully and painfully and imperfectly, beginning to come back together. Outside in the corridor, Hawk was talking into a phone. In the garage, the 2.5M Harley sat under 3 industrial lights and held its secrets in its calibration chambers, all of them spoken now, all of them written down, all of them finally free of the machine and in the hands of the living. Somewhere in Phoenix, a federal investigator's phone was about to ring, and Ray Tolliver sat on a bar stool in the Maricopa Hells Angels compound and stared at his coffee and understood, with the full weight of 23 years of careful criminal operation pressing down on a single moment, that the machine nobody could fix had just fixed everything. Hawk's federal contact picked up on the 3rd ring. His name was Warren Spade, and Hawk had cultivated the relationship over 6 years through the specific patient diplomacy of a chapter president who understood that an organization operating at the edge of the law needed at minimum one person inside legitimate authority who answered his calls. Warren was not corrupt. That was the entire value of him, a man who was not corrupt and who knew the difference between an organization and its worst members, and who had, over 6 years of careful interaction with Hawk Morrison, developed enough professional respect to listen before he judged. He listened now for 8 minutes. When Hawk finished, Warren said, "You're telling me you have a witness who was present at a conversation in 2001 describing account-specific financial transactions involving at least 2 senior members of your chapter and an unidentified outside facilitator." "I'm telling you I have a witness," Hawk said. "And I'm telling you the witness encoded the specific account information into a mechanical system in 2001, that the encoding has been preserved intact in a motorcycle in my garage, and that my attorney has already been called and will be present within 2 hours." He paused. "I'm also telling you that the primary active subject of this information is currently sitting in my main hall and has not left the building." A pause on Warren's end. "You're holding him?" "Nobody is being held. He's sitting at a bar. He's choosing to sit there because the alternative, walking out and running, is an option he understands he's considering." Hawk. Warren's voice had the careful quality of a man navigating between professional obligation and personal relationship. "What you're describing is significant. If the account information holds up and the encoding can be authenticated, and I want to be clear that authentication is going to require—" "I understand what authentication requires," Hawk said. "Daniel Dawson built the system. He is physically present. He can walk your people through the encoding methodology, the construction dates, the calibration specifications. He can demonstrate, chamber by chamber, how the information was embedded and how it is retrieved. A beat. He's been carrying this for 20 years, Warren. He's ready to talk." Another pause. Then Warren said, "Give me 90 minutes." Hawk ended the call. He stood in the corridor for a moment, very still, with the phone in his hand, and 20 years of trust being restructured in real time somewhere behind his eyes. Then he went back into the main hall. Caleb saw him come through the door and read his face in 1 second. Hawk gave him the smallest nod. "Done. Coming." The nod of a man who has set something large in motion and is now managing the interval. 90 minutes. The main hall had developed its own gravity. Nobody had left, which was itself significant, in a compound full of men who were accustomed to making their own decisions about when to stay and when to go. Something in the weight of the night had communicated itself without being named, and 40-some people had collectively decided that leaving before they understood what they had been part of was not something they were willing to do. Victor Malone had not moved from his position near Tolliver. He had not spoken to him again after the single exchange. He sat on his bar stool with a coffee he wasn't drinking and kept his body between Tolliver and the door with the easy, practiced authority of a man who had spent decades understanding how space worked in rooms like this one. Tolliver had gone very still. That was the tell, Caleb had decided. The stillness. A guilty man with options moves, he shifts. He tests, he recalibrates his position every few minutes, looking for the angle that opens. A guilty man who understands that all his options have closed goes very, very still, like an animal that has stopped running not because it's safe, but because running has become pointless. Daniel stood beside Caleb and watched Tolliver with an expression that was not triumph and not anger and not relief. It was the expression of a man fulfilling a very long-standing obligation. Something owed, being paid. The specific quality of reckoning. "How are you doing?" Caleb said low. Daniel looked at him. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Ask me in a week." "Fair enough." A pause. Then Daniel said, "I want to explain something to you. About leaving. About the real reason, not the version I gave you in Flagstaff, which was true, but which was not complete." Caleb looked at him. "The danger was real," Daniel said. "Tolliver's network was real. The risk was real, and I was not being cowardly when I said I stayed away to stay invisible." He paused. "But there was another element. One I have not said out loud to anyone, including your mother." He stopped, breathed. I was ashamed. Not of the situation, of how I handled it. A man who found something that needed to be exposed, and instead of finding the right way to expose it, ran. Left a machine with secrets in it and manufactured parts for it from 4 states away and told himself it was strategy. His jaw was tight. It was partly strategy, and it was partly a man who was afraid that if he came back and told the truth, the people he respected most would look at him and see someone who failed when it mattered. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Hawk doesn't see that," he said. "No, he doesn't." Daniel looked across the room at Hawk, who was talking quietly with Eddie near the garage door. "He never did. That's the thing about Hawk. He sees what people are, not what they failed to be." He paused. "I forgot that. For 20 years, I forgot that." "You're here now," Caleb said. "I'm here now," Daniel agreed. He said it the way a man says something he has needed to say for a long time and is only now, in this specific moment, fully able to mean. 40 minutes passed. The room breathed and waited. Someone brought coffee out from the kitchen, and it moved around the tables without anyone asking for it. The instinctive communal gesture of people settling in for something long. Eddie brought Caleb a cup and set one near Daniel without a word and gave Victor one too. And Victor looked at it for a moment and then looked at Eddie and said thanks in a voice that was doing double duty, thanking him for the coffee and acknowledging something larger that didn't have a simpler word. At 6:45 in the morning, 2 vehicles pulled into the compound lot. Hawk's attorney, a compact woman named Patricia Chen, who had driven from Scottsdale in just over an hour and who walked into the main hall with a leather bag over her shoulder, and the brisk, evaluating manner of someone accustomed to arriving at situations that had already become complicated, assessed the room in approximately 15 seconds and went directly to Hawk. Behind her, a second vehicle. Warren Spade was a man in his early 50s, with the build and posture of someone who had spent years being present in difficult rooms without making himself the center of them. He came in with one other agent, a younger woman, with a notepad already open, and he made eye contact with Hawk across the room and nodded once. The nod of 2 men who have had a long professional understanding that is now being activated for the first time at full weight. Caleb watched Tolliver see the federal plates through the window. He watched a man understand completely, and finally, that the interval was over. Tolliver set his coffee down. He looked at Victor. He looked at Daniel. He looked around the room at 40 men who were looking back at him, and for the first time in 23 years, Tolliver was not in a room where careful positioning and long-established relationships gave him any cover at all. "Ray," Hawk said. He had crossed the room and was standing 10 feet from Tolliver, and his voice was quiet and direct, the voice he used when he had decided that a thing was going to happen, and the only variable was how much difficulty the next 30 seconds contained. "There are people here who would like to speak with you." Tolliver looked at him. His face had finally given up its practiced blankness, and what was underneath it was what Caleb had expected, not remorse, not guilt exactly, but the specific resignation of a man who has made a professional calculation and arrived at its conclusion. "I want my attorney," he said. "You can call anyone you like," Hawk said. "No one is stopping you." Patricia Chen was already at the table with her bag open, talking to Warren's partner in a low, rapid exchange. Warren himself had gone to Daniel and was introducing himself with the formal courtesy of someone who understood that the man in front of him had done something difficult over a very long time and deserved to be treated accordingly. Caleb watched his father shake Warren Spade's hand. He watched Daniel Dawson, 53 years old, mechanic and fabricator and ghost of a man who had been circling home for 2 decades, stand up straight and look a federal agent in the eye and begin, in a clear and measured voice, to tell the truth. The formal interview happened in the small office off the main hall. Patricia Chen was present for Daniel's side of it, which was Hawks doing a quiet insistence that Daniel had a lawyer in the room before he said a word on the record, a protection extended without being asked for. The kind of thing that a man does for another man when he is trying to demonstrate, in the only language that matters, that the trust which was broken is being rebuilt. Caleb sat outside the office door and waited. Victor came and sat beside him after a while. They had not spoken directly, since Caleb had told him everything in the main hall an hour and a half ago, and the silence between them now was different from the silences of earlier in the night, less loaded, less careful. More like the silence between two people who have been through something together and are resting in the aftermath of it. He's going to be okay, Victor said. He meant Daniel. I know, Caleb said. Whatever happens with the legal side, the investigation, the timeline, all of that, he's going to be okay. Victor paused. Because he came back. The rest is just process. Caleb looked at him. Are you going to be okay? Victor was quiet for a moment. I'm going to do something I should have done 20 years ago, he said. I'm going to go see Carol, my sister. I'm going to tell her what I did. Not to relieve my own guilt, I gave up on that being the point a while ago. But because she deserves to know that the man she never blamed for the accident spent 20 years trying to make it right, and that the reason he couldn't come back wasn't cowardice. It was the same kind of overdeveloped conscience that got him in trouble in the first place. He paused. She'll want to know that. She was always fair about him. I wasn't. His voice was rough at the edges. I owe her the full picture. That's the right thing, Caleb said. Yeah. Victor looked at his hands. Doing the right thing about 20 years too late is still doing the right thing. I've been sitting with that all night. The office door opened at 8:15 a.m. Daniel came out first. He looked tired in the way that people look tired after they have set down something extraordinarily heavy, not depleted, but lighter than before. And the lightness had its own unfamiliarity to it, the slightly uncertain quality of moving through the world without the weight you've been compensating for. He looked at Caleb sitting against the wall, and something in his face loosened in a way that it hadn't quite managed to in the kitchen, in Flagstaff, or in the truck, or in any of the previous hours. Done, Caleb said. First session, Daniel said. There will be more. But the primary documentation is on record. He sat down on the other side of Caleb from Victor. The three of them sat in a row against the wall, outside the office door. A 22-year-old, and a 61-year-old, and a 53-year-old, all of them worn down in different ways by a night that had started with a rainstorm and an engine and had arrived here. What happens now? Caleb asked. Investigation, Daniel said. Warren's team pulls the account records, traces the shell businesses, builds the case. It takes time. Months, probably. He paused. Tolliver will lawyer up and make it complicated. But the account information is specific and dated, and the encoding methodology is verifiable. There's enough. And you? Caleb said. What happens to you now? Daniel looked at the wall across from them. He was quiet for long enough that Caleb started to think he wasn't going to answer. And then he said, I have a workshop in Flagstaff. 4 restoration projects in process. A mortgage on a small property. He paused. I have a son who drove 3 hours in the middle of the night and fixed a 20-year problem in under an hour. He stopped again. I don't know exactly what happens next, but I know what I want to happen. Tell me, Caleb said. I want to come back to this compound, Daniel said. Not as a member, I walked away from that, and I walked away from it for complicated reasons, and I don't think the answer is to act like I didn't. But as the mechanic, if Hawk will have me, he paused, and I want to know my son. Not catch up with him, not make up for lost time. That's not a thing you can make up. I just want to know him from here, from this point, whatever that looks like. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about 22 years of a man-shaped absence. He thought about a socket wrench in a graduation photograph and a $20 box of parts and a ring stamped with initials in a metal housing. He thought about all the ways his father had been present from a distance, reaching toward him in the only language he had available, the language of precision and engineering, and the specific love of a man who cannot close the last 70 miles, but who manufactures the components anyway, just in case. That's what I want too, Caleb said. Hawk found them outside the office at 8:40. He had the look of a man who had been managing multiple things simultaneously for many hours and was beginning, cautiously, to believe that the managing had worked. He stopped in front of them and looked at Daniel and said, Warren's team is securing Tolliver. They're doing it quiet, no drama, no scene. He'll be gone in about 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. The chapter needs to be told, Hawk said. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. He paused. I want you in the room when I do it. Daniel looked at him. Why? Because they need to see you, Hawk said simply. Some of them have been writing with a story about you for 20 years that isn't the right story. You're not a man who abandoned the chapter. You're a man who protected it the only way you had available at the time. His voice was steady. They need to hear that from me, and they need to see your face when they hear it. Daniel stood up. Okay, he said. The main hall had thinned slightly. Some men had moved outside. Some were getting coffee, the general drift of a large group in a waiting pattern. When Hawk walked to the center of the room, the drift stopped. It always stopped for Hawk. 20-plus years of authority had given him a gravitational quality that didn't require announcement. Daniel stood to Hawk's left. Caleb stood behind his father, slightly to the side, and watched the room orient toward the two men at its center. Hawk talked for 5 minutes. He was not a man who used excess words, and what he said was the distilled version, enough truth to correct the story, not so much detail that it compromised what was still an active situation. He said that Daniel Dawson had left in 2001 to protect information that was dangerous to possess inside the chapter. He said that the information had been encoded in the motorcycle, that the motorcycle had now run for the first time in 20 years because of a 22-year-old mechanic who had arrived in the middle of a rainstorm and done in 1 hour what every credentialed expert over two decades had failed to do. He said that the situation was being handled through proper channels and that the chapter was clean, that no active member bore responsibility for what had happened, that the rot had been identified and was being removed. He did not say Tolliver's name in that room. That would come later, through proper channels, when it was appropriate. What he said instead, at the end, was, Daniel Dawson is a member of this brotherhood. He has been since 1998. That membership does not expire because a man had to make an impossible choice in an impossible situation and spent 20 years living with it. He paused. He's home. That's all that matters right now. He's home. The room was very quiet. Then a man at the back, Caleb never found out his name, started to clap. Not performance clapping, not the polite variety. The real kind, slow and heavy, the kind that means something. It moved through the room the way real things move, not instantly, but with the gathering momentum of people arriving at the same feeling from different directions. Daniel Dawson stood in the center of that room and received it with the face of a man who does not feel he deserves it and who is choosing, consciously and with difficulty, to let it reach him anyway. Caleb watched his father's jaw work. He watched him breathe. He watched him stay. At 9:15, Tolliver was gone. Warren's partner had handled it with the specific, practiced discretion of someone who understood that the manner of these things matters as much as the fact of them. And by the time most of the compound understood what had happened, Tolliver's truck was no longer in the lot, and 2 business cards had been left with Hawk for follow-up communication. Patricia Chen spent another 20 minutes with Hawk at the corner table, going over next steps, making notes, giving him the careful professional advice of someone who was both his attorney and, clearly, someone who had been in difficult rooms with him before and trusted his judgment within them. When she left, Hawk came to find Caleb in the garage. Caleb was doing the only thing that felt natural after a night like this one. He was at the workbench with the 2.5M Harley, checking the calibration system, verifying that the replacement ring he'd used the night before was seated properly, running a slow and thorough check of every system he'd touched. It was not necessary. The bike was running. He had heard it run. But the check was something his hands needed to do, and he had learned early in his life not to argue with his hands when they needed to work. Hawk stood beside him for a moment and watched. Your father taught you that, Hawk said. The listening before touching. He couldn't have, Caleb said. I never met him until 6 hours ago. He taught your hands, Hawk said. Some things go that way. Caleb stopped and looked at the motorcycle. The extraordinary machine, The 2.5 million artifact that had become a hiding place and a record and a message, and now, finally, simply what it had always been, meant to be the finest expression of one man's mechanical genius, running the way it was built to run, carrying nothing hidden anymore. What happens to it? Caleb said. The bike? Hawk looked at it. It rides. That's what it was built for. He paused. There's going to be a run. A proper one, first run in 20 years. Bike running the way it should. I'm thinking 2 weeks. Give the situation time to settle. Give people time to get here. He looked at Caleb. I want you and Daniel on that run. Caleb thought about 2 weeks. He thought about his toolbox and his worn boots and the fact that he had nowhere to be and no fixed plan and had not, as of yesterday afternoon, had anything that qualified as a home. I don't have a bike, he said. Hawk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, come with me. He led Caleb to the far end of the garage, to a section partitioned off with a canvas curtain that Caleb had not paid attention to in the events of the night before. Hawk pulled the curtain back. Behind it was a motorcycle. It was older, a 1998 Sportster, by the look of it, and it had been in a state of partial frustration for what appeared to be some time. The frame was solid, the engine was present and complete, and the bodywork had been started but not finished. It was not the 2.5 million Harley. It was not extraordinary, as that bike was extraordinary, but it had good bones, and it had the quality of a machine that someone had started with real intention and then set aside because life had gotten in the way. That was your father's first project in this garage, Hawk said. The bike that got him the job, more or less. He started the restoration and then got absorbed in the big build and never came back to it. He looked at it. I kept it. I don't know exactly why. Sentimentality, maybe, or stubbornness. He paused. It needs probably 2 weeks of work to be rideable. Maybe less. With the right hands. Caleb looked at the 1998 Sportster. He looked at the engine, the frame, the unfinished bodywork. He looked at it the way he looked at all machines, listening first, before touching, asking it what it was trying to be. What it was trying to be, he decided, was finished. I'll need some parts, he said. We have a parts account, Hawk said. Use it. And a place to sleep for 2 weeks. There's a room off the garage, Hawk said. Basic, but it's got a bed and a working shower. It's been used as overflow before. It's yours. Caleb turned and looked at Hawk Morrison, the chapter president, who had kept a motorcycle running on faith for 20 years, who had driven 3 hours through a monsoon remnant at midnight to bring a ghost home, who had made 5 phone calls in the dark of a corridor that had collectively changed the trajectory of a dozen lives. He thought about what it took to be a man like that, not the authority, not the patches, not the decades of history, but the specific, daily choice to take responsibility for things that extended beyond yourself, to hold space for people, even when they had made themselves absent, to keep a machine in a garage and believe, against 20 years of evidence, that someone was eventually going to come and make it run. Thank you, Caleb said. Hawk looked at him. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't seen the room. It was, in fact, not much of a room, but it had a bed and a working shower, exactly as advertised. And when Caleb set his toolbox down in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed for the first time since the previous afternoon, he felt the weight of the night settle into his bones all at once and understood that he was going to sleep for a very long time. He called his mother first. She picked up immediately, which meant she hadn't slept either. He told her the short version that Daniel was here, that things had happened, that everything was going to take time, but was moving in the right direction. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Are you okay? She said. Yeah, he said. I think for the first time in a while, I really am. He's a good man, she said carefully. Not as an excuse and not as an apology. Just as a fact that she had been carrying for a long time and was handing him now. He made mistakes, big ones. But he's a good man, Caleb. I know, Caleb said. I can see that. After he ended the call, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and the room quiet around him. He thought about the calibration ring still in his pocket, the original one, Dee Dee stamped into the metal, the one that had lived in Victor Malone's vest for 20 years. He took it out and looked at it. He was going to give it to his father. Not today. Today was too full, too large, too much. But soon, he was going to give it back and let Daniel decide what to do with it. Whether to put it in the machine where it belonged, or keep it, or give it to someone, or set it on a shelf and let it be what it was, a record of something broken and retrieved. The physical weight of a long detour that had somehow, against all reasonable probability, ended in the right place. He set the ring on the small table beside the bed. He lay down without taking off his boots. He was asleep in under 2 minutes. The first run happened 16 days later. Not 2 weeks, 16 days. Because Daniel needed 3 extra days with Warren's team for follow-up documentation, and because Eddie had organized something larger than Hawk had initially planned, and because word had spread far enough through the regional network that bikes were coming from 4 other chapters, and it only made sense to wait until they could all be there. The morning of the run, Caleb rolled the 1998 Sportster out of the garage at 7 a.m. It was finished. 14 days of work, most of it done in the evenings after Daniel had finished with the lawyers and the investigators and the ongoing careful business of being the key witness in a case that was already, according to Patricia Chen, moving faster than federal cases usually moved because the financial documentation from the shell businesses had been easier to trace than Tolliver's 23 years of careful concealment had intended. His outside contact in Phoenix, a man named Gerald Cross, who had been running money through 3 different hospitality businesses, had cooperated within 48 hours of being approached, which had the cascading effect of making Tolliver's denial strategy collapse before it was fully constructed. It was not over. It would not be over for months, legally. But the shape of it was clear, and the shape was the right shape, and Daniel could live with months if the shape was right. The Sportster ran clean. Caleb had rebuilt the engine over the first 4 days, addressed the fuel system on day 5 and 6, finished the bodywork over the second week with help from a compound member named Tomas, who turned out to have a steadier hand with a paint gun than anyone had a right to expect. The bike was not beautiful, the way the 2.5M Harley was beautiful. It was not that kind of machine and had never claimed to be. But it was right. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Nothing hidden, nothing unfinished. Built with care from the bones of something that had been waiting 16 years for someone to come back and complete it. Daniel came out of the side door at 7:15 and stopped when he saw it. He had known Caleb was working on it. He'd come into the garage most evenings and sat on a stool and talked while Caleb worked. The two of them finding their way into the specific language of a father and son who are starting from nothing and building forward with whatever materials are available. It turned out the materials were considerable. It turned out they were similar in ways that went beyond the jaw and the forehead, and the hands similar in the way they thought about problems, in the patience they had for mechanical things, and the shorter patience they had for social performance, in the specific dry humor that emerged when they were both tired and comfortable and not performing anything for anyone. They were not there yet, not fully, not completely. 22 years of absence does not resolve in 16 days. But they were building towards something real at a pace that felt honest, and honest was the thing they both needed most. Daniel looked at the finished Sportster. He walked around it slowly. He checked the engine the way Caleb had checked the 2.5M Harley on the first night, hands before tools, listening before touching. He crouched beside the rebuilt engine casing and ran his fingers along the seam. And Caleb could see him reading the quality of the work in the way that only another mechanic could read it, not just what it looked like, but what it said about the hands that did it. He stood back up. "You used a modified timing configuration on the primary chain," he said. "Standard spec would have worked, but you went tighter." "Tighter gives you better response at low RPM," Caleb said. "For a machine this age, low RPM is where you spend most of your time." Daniel looked at him. "I would have done the same thing," he said. "I know," Caleb said. Daniel stood with his hand on the Sportster and looked at his son and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the moment hadn't already said more precisely than words could make. Victor arrived at 8. and he came in through the gate with the careful manner of a man who is returning to a room where he is uncertain of his welcome, which was a reasonable uncertainty, and one that Hawk resolved by crossing the lot and meeting him at the gate and shaking his hand in front of everyone present. The message was not subtle and was not meant to be. Victor's decisions and Victor's mistakes were known now to everyone who needed to know them, and the chapter had made its collective assessment in the 16 intervening days. And the assessment was the kind that communities arrive at when the facts are complete and the person has been honest, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a space which forgiveness could eventually become possible. Victor shook Hawk's hand, and then he walked to Daniel. The two men stood facing each other in the lot, with 50 people watching, and neither of them pretended that the watching didn't exist, because pretending would have been the wrong thing. This needed to happen in the open. It had been hidden long enough. "I am sorry," Victor said. He said it the way the word is supposed to be said, not as a social lubricant, not as the verbal equivalent of checking a box, but as a genuine acknowledgement delivered directly to the person it was owed. "I did something I cannot undo, and it cost you things that cannot be returned. I'm sorry, Daniel." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," he said finally. "I knew it before tonight. Before all of this." He paused. "You were hurting and you did something wrong. I understand that. I've had 20 years to understand it." He extended his hand. "We're not what we were. That's gone. But maybe we figure out what we are now." Victor took his hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. The extra second, that means something different from the handshake itself, the acknowledgement that a terrible thing happened and has been looked at directly and will not be pretended away. The run started at 9 a.m., 27 motorcycles in formation, bikes from the Maricopa chapter, and the 4 that had come from the regional network, and the 2.5M Harley at the front, ridden by Hawk Morrison, its engine producing the deep and steady and powerful sound that it had always been designed to produce, and that nobody had heard for 20 years until 6 nights ago in this same compound. Behind Hawk, Daniel on his own machine, and behind Daniel, on the finished 1998 Sportster that had been his father's first project and his son's final gift to the 16 days they'd had to start becoming something to each other, Caleb Dawson, 22 years old, worn boots, grease in the creases of his hands that no amount of washing entirely removed anymore, which was fine, which was correct, which was the mark of a person who worked with their hands and was not apologetic about what that left behind. He had arrived in this compound with a toolbox and the last pieces of a broken life. What he was leaving with was not the absence of broken things. The broken things were still broken. The years were still gone. The calibration ring in his pocket was still a record of damage that real people had caused and real people had carried. None of that was erased. None of it would be. What he was leaving with was the knowledge that broken things can run, that a machine hidden with secrets can be read, that a man circling home for 20 years can close the last 70 miles if the right person shows up in the rain and opens the door, that the family you find can be the one that was always yours, just separated by distance and time and the accumulation of choices that seemed, individually, to make sense, and which collected into a weight that took 22 years and one extraordinary night to put down. The formation moved through the compound gate and onto the open road. The sun was fully up, and the air had the clean, sharp quality of Arizona after rain, and the sound of 27 engines was the sound of something restored not to what it was, because you cannot restore to what was, only forward to what can be. Caleb rode and felt the road under him, and the engine under that in the day, opening at the head of the formation like something that had been waiting at a very long distance, and was now, finally, close enough to reach. His father was 2 bikes ahead of him. He could see his shoulders, his jacket, the way he rode upright and steady and without any visible effort, the way people move through spaces they were built for. Caleb rode toward him. The man who built the most extraordinary machine any of them had ever seen had spent 20 years getting as far as Flagstaff and his son had covered the rest of the distance in one rainy night with a 42-pound toolbox and the specific stubbornness of a person who has never had a reason to stop moving and has finally found one. Some things know where they belong. Some families are not lost, they are only separated by distance and silence and the long wait of choices made under impossible conditions. Waiting for the one night when a gate latch lifts and an engine fires, and a 22-year-old kid with nothing but his hands and his instincts walks into a garage and listens before he touches, and hears in the failure of a machine the shape of a story that was never finished. Caleb Dawson finished it. On a road in Arizona, in the clean morning after a long rain, riding a bike his father started and he completed, surrounded by the brotherhood that had held the space for both of them. Across 20 years of absence, Caleb Dawson rode forward, and the road was open, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be.